code stuff, animations. I've got like a big long list of different topics that we're going to be talking about. Some more technical stuff and maybe even a little bit of code review stuff along the way. And then I think we'll probably take your questions as well. So thanks for coming out. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up button and go share the stream before we get started and just start dropping your questions into chat. People will be kind of watching as we're talking about other things, and we'll get back to them as soon as we can. All right. Thanks again, everybody, for coming out and joining us. Thanks, Jason, Yorai, and Andrew for all being here. Everybody want to just say a quick hello?
Hello.
Hi.
Howdy.
That was pretty quick. All right. So one of the first things that I wanted to talk about was an article that I sent you guys. I sent it over to everybody, and I think it should be down in the description below. I think I'll pop it up on the screen as well. It was about video cards dying, about RTX cards specifically dying, playing New World, and how it seems to be not super rare. And I don't know how actually rare this is. Let's see if I can pop this article up here. Get it on the screen. So it says that Amazon's New World MMO is apparently sending GeForce video cards to the CPU graveyard. It's kind of, it seems kind of sensational and all, because I mean it's probably not specifically just this game, but I was kind of curious what was going on here. And I read through the whole thing, and it seems like essentially what's going on was that in the menu screen, there's nothing limiting the frame rate, and for some reason, that's causing the video card to probably overheat or have some other problem that's killing it. But I don't know enough about the technical parts of a video card and the internals of them to understand why that would be the case, or if that's even technically possible. Just kind of curious if any of you guys know, or if anybody in chat happens to know anything about this. Is that something that could happen, and why is it that having just a high frame rate rendering pretty much nothing would cause that? Anybody got thoughts?
So generally speaking, your graphics card tries to push out commands that it finishes to whatever comes out, and depending on how fast it can do it, it will send out more commands, like, hey, draw this, hey, draw that. Now, if you finish the commands very fast, it means you have a higher frame rate, which means it tries to push out more frames. You know how in games you have the ability to set a frame cap or no limit? When you set no limit, it will try and push out those commands as fast as it can, regardless of the output. So while it should be throttled on the GPU's end, like, hey, I can take all these commands, please stop, some games, if they use a custom engine, will probably have a chance to forget that. So that is probably what's going on with the New World thing. Now, I did mention that the GPU should be able to block it on its own. The problem with the EVGA cards is they supposedly didn't do it right, and that caused them to overheat.
That's interesting. I thought there had to be something kind of like that. There's kind of a mix of both hardware and software going on there, causing the issues. I guess it makes me a little bit less concerned about playing more New World, which I did actually get to try out, by the way. I don't know if you guys have played that. I didn't even ask beforehand. Have any of you guys tried out New World yet?
I tried to get in on launch day, and I found myself with a 200 ping on a queue that will last 8 hours. So I said, thank you, and I'll wait.
Oh, okay.
And
yeah.
While I waited, it crashed. So
oh, man. Yeah, I played a little bit, a couple hours, maybe like 2 or 3 hours total. Got to, I think, level 10. And it did have some queue time, though. I think it was about a half hour each time trying to get in. But there were a lot of servers without a queue time. I just picked the one that my kid was on. So he was already playing on one. I figured I'll join him and see if I can catch up. There's no way I'll be able to catch up. Yeah, you can't catch up to a teenager playing an MMO especially. They have way too much time available that I just don't have. But so far, it seems like a relatively interesting game. It was not what I was expecting at all. And it seems pretty well put together, pretty well done. Aside from this one issue that probably isn't actually their fault, it seems like it's it could be a fun, interesting game. I have no idea what it's like long term though, or past 3 hours. I just know that the beginner experience was really polished and pretty good. So
Yeah, I really want to say that the server thing isn't their fault, though they are in control of where they go. They own Amazon Web Services, so
Yeah.
there's a degree of that. I saw a lot of the Steam reviews saying there are no Asia servers, so they had to join the Australia ones, which sounds like a malfunction of some sort. Like they wanted to get it up, but it couldn't. I'm not exactly sure what's going on there.
Huh. I wonder if it's just regulation stuff trying to get them into China or something.
I'm not sure it would be that. They could pick anywhere else in Asia that isn't
I guess.
that. One thing I did find very interesting about the server setup for the game is that only 2,000 players can join any single instance at a time, and I have multiple reasons why I can justify such a thing, which I thought might be interesting to talk about.
I think
From a
that would
game,
be very interesting to talk about. Let's dive
so
into it.
sure. So, from my understanding, there's this thing that's been going on in mobile games mainly, which when you want to add competition to a game, you don't want the competition to end up stagnant, and you don't want one side to constantly win over the other. Now, people will often try to shift towards the side that's winning, and the factions are kind of a big thing in the New World thing. Um, so what you'll find in most mobile games is that they make small competitions for single players, and they put like 20 players in a bucket and say, hey, become first place, because people will be trying to invest more if they can see they have an actual chance. Now, New World, I think they did only 2,000 players as a partially because of that. So like saying, there are only 2,000 players, 1,000 players are asleep, we have a chance, let's take the entire world or something. The server, to be precise. Now, another perspective can be if a single server is a single spun up instance of the application, then of course it cannot handle a million players. So they might have segmented it this way. I don't think it's that, but tell me your thoughts.
No, I think you're probably right because my guess is even with really really old tech, it would be pretty easy to support 2,000 more than 2,000 active players on the server on any game server. So at least on any MMO server, assuming it's a big world and people are spread out and you'll have maybe a couple hundred in an area at a time. But I think that the harder part is definitely having enough content so that it's not overwhelmed and that you don't go to like every remote place and it's got 30 or 40 people just sitting around waiting for something to spawn. Because you're right, if the world isn't huge and the number of people is big or the number of active people is large, it's gonna feel like there's not a lot of content and that there's not a lot of exploration or gameplay going on really. And it does make a lot of sense to kind of limit that down. The other option that I don't know if they use at all is to just have different instances of the zones that everybody, it's one of the common things that a lot of games do. Just spin up different instances of it, so you just go into your own copy, but you're still on the same server. I don't really like that, so I think I'd rather have like the 2,000 person limit probably. I don't know though. I mean, maybe they just need a bigger world too. Who knows?
Yeah, that's
But I
possible.
highly doubt it's something technical that they can't solve. I mean, maybe it is, but it seems like it'd be strange because they've got all the power in the world and all the bandwidth, and I don't know how their deal with Amazon works out. Like if they just have some allowance of AWS services that they're allowed to use, or just totally unlimited.
You'd think it's unlimited because they want the game to succeed, but we don't know.
Yeah, with big
What?
companies, they tend to like to bill internally between each other, like the different departments and stuff, and never know. They're so
Yeah.
huge. Who knows how that thing's run?
One thing you did mention that was very funny is when you mentioned that if you see a bunch of players in a single place, it might feel like the world isn't big. But there's also another concern is that New World has player collision, so players cannot get through each other. So you end up with cities cramped, and then they have to struggle to reach one side to the other because everybody's trying to talk to the same NPCs. That's actually been one of my favorite things to see in games lately. Ever since The Division 1 came out, Tom Clancy's The Division, when on launch day there was this single NPC at the start that you had to talk to in an office, and all the players spawned there, but there was player
I
collision.
remember
and
that you can find videos of that online where there's just a queue. There's just tons and tons of players sitting in a room going, we're literally waiting for each person to get off the damn computer so we can take turns just to start the game. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
Makes it much more realistic.
Yeah, everybody just got in line like really nicely. Some jumped around, but nobody like interfered or tried to bump in the middle, and it was like really civil and nice. Made you feel like part of a community. Also in New World, if you've been checking the Reddit, you can see there's like a bunch of bonfires because there's a campfires, sorry, because there's a mission to do that, and you had to place it outside of town. So everybody goes out of town like one step, puts a campfire, and another one does that, and it looks like the entire place is burnt.
I haven't gotten that far. I have seen some campfires randomly placed. I gotta find that. It's a pretty fun game, though. So anybody that's thinking about trying it out, it seems kind of interesting, or at least worth trying for learning alone, like just for getting ideas and experimenting. Or you haven't played it yet, Andrew?
Unfortunately, they didn't make it for the Mac, so no.
Oh, well, you should give it a shot or check out some videos just for inspiration.
I have seen some videos. I saw someone playing it live on launch day. It looked pretty cool. MMOs of it's. I tried playing World of Warcraft years ago, and I was utterly disappointed. It just seemed weird and not fun to me because I'm guessing all the MMO stuff is just not for me. But I haven't played an MMO except for one on mobile I tried a year ago or so in any recent time period. So I should try again. But there seems to be key components about MMOs that are very different from single player games. And like the campfire thing where everyone's doing the same quest type of thing. That is something I haven't wrapped my head around yet, I think, as a player.
But when you played World of Warcraft and other stuff, were you playing like by yourself or were you playing with friends?
Yeah, you beat me to it because I was going to say the same thing. Is that
a huge difference.
I did not like MMOs when I played them. It was like, this is boring. I don't get it. It's repetitious. I'm watching lines of people do the same thing as me. Why do people play these games? And then 4 of us friends got a few beers and played a game together in one room, and we're like, oh, this is why. Now it's this sort of whispered shared knowledge of, oh, go to this place. I hear there's a good weapon there, and you do this thing, and okay, what steps do I have to do for this? And you're sharing information, and you're running around, and it's a lot more interesting when it's like, because there's a lot of grindy, repetitious tasks, and if you're doing that while able to have dialogue in between, that's more entertaining. But if it's literally just go kill 20 boars or something, it starts to get pretty exhausting. So it's a vastly different experience.
Yes, so I need to find this thing you call friends. Once I do that, then maybe it would be different. Yeah.
But you have to get you some of those. Yeah, that's it does make a huge difference. Like playing an MMO with people you know or just friends, or sometimes you make friends on there playing it, but usually starting with friends and then making other friends. It makes a huge difference. I think just in how much fun you'll have. I mean, I was also an MMO addict, though. I mean, I played thousands and thousands and thousands of hours. Like my played time was always measured in days, and it was in the thousands of days of time online on my characters because I had a problem.
Yeah.
But it was a lot of fun, and I made a lot of friends, and I got jobs from it. So it worked out well.
My very first exposure to World of Warcraft was back in probably 2005, 2006. A friend of mine stayed at my place when I was gone for a month, and she installed World of Warcraft on my computer because she was bored and she had her own account. And she was very excited to show me the game. I was like, okay, cool. I'm into RPGs. Let me see. And she spent the next half an hour walking somewhere. And she wanted to avoid a fight. So for a little while, she swam. And then she was walking again. And I was just like, we just spent a half an hour doing nothing. So that was my very first exposure to it. Maybe it biased me.
Yeah, you got to be addicted to it before that's acceptable. For first you get in, you play, you have all the fun and get the addicted part, and then that part becomes fun.
Totally.
My wife actually played World of Warcraft for 2 days. So my wife like doesn't play video games at all. Or she pretty much never. She'll play like Mario Brothers every now and then, and that's pretty much it. Sometimes I can get her to play the Street Fighter over there with me, but she doesn't like video games in general. But she played World of Warcraft. Or this is a long time ago. This is when it first came out, right? And I got her to play for like a day, and she played for like 12 hours straight. I was like, I can't do this ever again. And just quit. Just had a blast just running around. I find that it was really good at making you get addicted from the start. Like you get in, and it was really good at just constant, just reward, 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 a little bit of a challenge and a reward. And it did a really good job of, I think, just kind of pushing that loop. It was one of the first online games that I played that really kind of pushed that loop. Most MMOs that I played before that, like you'd get in and you'd die, right? And then you'd run around and you would die. And then you'd finally find something like 2 hours later that let you not die for a little while, and then you die again and just keep getting beaten. World of Warcraft was very different. So it got her like addicted, I think, within the first day. And then she was like, yep, can't do this anymore. I got to take care of kids and things. It was bad. Just gave it up. But yeah.
Very unfortunate.
Yeah.
I tried to get into those kinds of games, but I just don't have the attention span for long repetition. The closest I ever got was Pokemon games and the grinding in those. But the main problem I found is my favorite thing in games is narrative. I like the idea of there being a narrative growing that you're engaged in changing. There's the hero's journey, whatever else. And the problem I have with all MMOs is the inherent lie at the base of every single one of them, which is you're the chosen one. Now you're the chosen one, and you're also the chosen one. It's like every single time I watch 100 people run across the field, knowing they've all been told the same quest, that they're also the only one who can save the day. It's just it ruins anything I could possibly enjoy out of it, because the whole thing to me just feels like a factory producing people all producing the same hero's journey, and it feels like a corporate job to me at that stage.
I wonder if that's why I never liked quests and MMOs. Like I've always kind of avoided them. EverQuest was like the one game that had them in there that I didn't mind, and they were like kind of secret, hidden little things that didn't pop up and tell you like you were some magic wizard going to do a thing. Like you just randomly kind of stumble upon it, and they were super rare. And then in every other game, it just became kind of like instructions with rewards. And then some story that I never read. Like I almost never read quest text. I don't know about you guys.
The one that forever will highlight to me just how stupid this is Elder Scrolls Online. Elder Scrolls Online was pretty good. Like it felt like a watered down Skyrim, which is fine. It's what I wanted. The closest any game was ever going to win me over would be mostly first person ish with the kind of mechanics I liked. It had everything going for it. And there's one part in the early missions where you're in your starting village and you do some stuff and you go off on some little side missions, and then you come back, and then at one stage, narratively speaking, the whole village is on fire. And it's like, oh, that's really dramatic. Like you've done something and the entire village is on fire. And it's like, quick, you gotta go, get everyone together, get into the boats, we're moving, we're changing village. And as I'm running around doing this, I'm noticing there's a whole bunch of people walking over and talking to trees and things that are on fire. I'm like, what are they? Oh, they're instanced into the non-on fire version of this town. So here's me trying to be immersed in this, like the town is crippled and exploding and everything's going to pieces and everyone has to get to the lifeboats, and there's just people like having a chat with things that aren't there for me. And it's like, okay, we're done. Like you nearly had me. I was nearly on board, and now all of a sudden I'm watching just like people walk around and stop dead still in the middle of the street and then run off jauntily to somewhere else. Like,
okay. Actually, I wanted to bring up first, this is very silly, but I think I had a similar experience in another game. I'm struggling to remember the name of. It was another old MMO. It wasn't Elder Scrolls. I think it was older. But in regards to you're the chosen one, there's something really interesting I wanted to bring up regarding Maplestory, if you've ever heard of this game. They started with everyone being a beginner and picking their class and like not being all that special and doing the same quests. But every class had to go to a different town, and in different towns you had different quests, and that started really nice and then tapered off once you started doing the same quests for everyone. And then they started doing something very interesting. They made time-limited classes. Specifically, they created a class that you have to pick on character creation, and it starts you off in a different area with a different quest line, and then they lock it off after a while. I think it was the Zero class that was only available for like a month or a patch, and it had an entire slew of different mechanics, different abilities, and a whole storyline with its own cutscenes. It was really super interesting. And right now they have like 40 something classes and they all have different quest lines. It's super interesting to look at.
Yeah, see, at least I like the approach. Like I'm not saying that this can't be solved. Like one another example is a City of Heroes. City of Heroes is starting you off as a new superhero. So you pick your powers, you join the city, and in that context, it's kind of fine because it's like, hey, welcome, new superhero. Go and stop crimes. Like it's okay. This is like what superheroes do. I don't need to be the only superhero. It just feels like My Hero Academia or something. There's just more people all joining the fight. It still had a little bit of that vibe because the city did have the moments where supposedly I'm fighting a big robot monster and people are walking through its legs to get to the nearby shop or something that they can't see it. So there is the occasional bit, but that one eased some of that, you know.
Yeah. Actually, a recent game that does something similar is Phantasy Star Online 2 New Genesis. Did you see the entire technical fiasco with that?
No.
So Phantasy Star Online 2 came out like 8 years ago or 9 years, and it's a relatively old game. It has a whole story, it reached its climax, and it has a bazillion items that you can find or buy in their microtransaction shops. And then the game was only available in Japan, and Microsoft, together with Sega, decided to bring it to the entire world. And they tried to revive the title with a new Genesis, which is essentially an entire new game, but they didn't want players to be separated. So they made an entire conversion process where you can take your Phantasy Star Online 2 character, bring it into Phantasy Star Online 2 New Genesis, and take it back whenever you want. So now if you go and play New Genesis, you can actively take your character and start playing the old Phantasy Star Online 2 once you run out of content. And they play entirely differently. And in the story, you're nothing special. You're like someone who descended helping the fight, and all the big bosses are actually in the world, so players bundle up and start hitting on them, and it's really fun. But it was really interesting to see how they managed to upgrade the character models in the old game so they look like the new ones with all the customization options. It's like really technically impressive.
I always like, I know it's a subtle thing, but I always like when things do that. Like in the new Mass Effect remastered, they've retroactively made all Commander Shepards look like the last Commander Shepard, most recent one, throughout the model, so it's consistent. It's a nice touch. They didn't have to do that, but it was quite nice now not having like your character vastly change appearance over the course of the game.
So when you say you can move your characters between the two games, like what actually moves with the character? Is it everything, like the inventory and all the skills and stuff, or you said they play different?
So the classes are not shared. So you start at level 1 in the New Genesis and level 1 in the Classic, depending on where you go. But all the items convert to a certain degree. So if you go into the Classic one, you get level 100 items, and you bring them into New Genesis. Their stats are recalculated in a way that makes them like viable, but slightly different from the items you can find in New Genesis. So they're still relatively strong. They have different stats, but they work. And all the random inventory items like vanity and collectibles, they have their separate inventory from the Classic to the New Genesis, and you can still swap between them if you need something. So you can take a Classic vanity item that you found and use it in New Genesis and vice versa, or etc. They have different currencies though, and I've found that there was some way that people are trying to convert like one currency to another. I'm not exactly sure how it's going, but Yeah.
And you said the items were randomly generated, right, or procedurally generated?
So the equipment items have randomized stats. So you can find a sword that has like plus 5% attack damage to enemies with shields or something like that, and you can upgrade them in different ways. So each equipment slot has about 8 randomly generated stats in the end game in the classic, and you can bring those to the new one, where they can only have about 4. But the new ones have higher base stats, so it's your choice if you want the specific stats or the more higher base stats. It's a pretty interesting setup of choices.
Yeah, I wonder if more games will do that. I've seen like a couple games in the past that let you do a little bit of upgrading, moving your character forward, but usually just in single player stuff. And the multiplayer things would like the most I can remember in the past was letting people keep like their names. Literally, that's it. I can't think of anything else. It allowed like, people to kind of like push up, but into a new version. I think it'll probably keep happening more in the future a little bit, but it's hard because you want people to go back through that whole process, and you want everybody to go through the new game process the way that it's designed.
Yeah, one thing I found with the new Genesis is that they don't add a lot of content, and the base game was relatively short. Like everybody could finish the entire new Genesis content in a weekend, so you just end up having to go to the classic one if you want to keep playing something interesting. And the classic one is like loaded; it has 8 years of development and the full story, etc., etc. But it plays different. It was really funny how it actually made it work in a way that I ended up playing more of the classic one than I played the new Genesis one, just because I ran out of content really quick, and it's mentioned in the YouTube comments now.
All right, so there were quite a few other things that we had on the list to talk about today. So I don't know if you guys have a preference on where we jump into. I kind of want to bitch about my computer dying, just I need to get it out of the way. And then I figured maybe we'll jump into Jason and Andrew's boundaries after that. Sounds good, you guys. So I just wanted to give everybody a real quick update. Anybody that's been trying to reach me for the last week, last Sunday, during the stream, we were talking about systems and talking about RAM and hardware and all that, and you'd mentioned that your 3090 died, right?
Yes.
And I was mentioning that we were talking about RAM, and I looked and half my RAM wasn't showing up. And I told you guys that I was having some weird system problems, that things were just randomly restarting and stuff, right? So after that, I was offline most of the day. But then Monday I was also offline most of the day, but I came into my office and I noticed my computer was rebooting when I walked into it. And I was like, that's weird. Like, it shouldn't just be randomly rebooting when I'm walking in here. So just turned it off. And then Tuesday I came back in. Oh, fucker wouldn't boot. It would not start up at all. It started up a little bit, and then it told me that there was a registry error. It wouldn't boot from either of my hard drives, gave it an error on both of them, even though they both have Windows installed. They should both be bootable. And then, yeah, I couldn't read, so wouldn't boot, kept giving me an error. I tried to repair it, nonstop errors, just saying, hey, this doesn't work. It would say, hey, try rebooting and hitting the error recovery, and fail every time. And then I couldn't reinstall Windows without formatting the drives. And like every normal bad developer, I've got a bunch of crap on here that I haven't backed up to source control or anywhere else. So I couldn't format my drives and lose it all. I was like, oh, well, I guess I could try format. Then I was like, oh, no, I've got a bunch of projects that I haven't committed to source control yet because they weren't quite important enough. But now I'm reminded again why source control is important, and everything should be in there, not just the things that I think are important. So yeah, anyway, long story short, I ended up killing that system, took it out. It was one that I had built myself. So for the longest time, pretty much ever since my first computer, I've been building them myself, putting it together, just getting a motherboard, getting a case, putting the processor in, putting the RAM in. And I always really like growing up, I loved doing it. I had a blast just building out computers, and I always think like, hey, I'm getting a good deal, I'll save some money, and I get to put this thing together and pick out the best parts. But this time, the last time that I did it, it was during COVID stuff. So I was trying to build a computer while everything was out of stock, and I hadn't done it in a very long time. So I ended up building this Threadripper system that took me like 4 trips back to Micro Center to find parts for, because I didn't realize that things weren't compatible, like my CPU cooler, and then my cooler didn't fit, my radiator didn't fit in there, all kinds of random problems. So this time I was like, that's it. I'm buying a pre-built system because I don't have the time. This is going to take me like, the last time it took me like 2 weeks to finish rebuilding the system.
Welcome to the party. I did exactly the same thing. I used to love really slow, methodical, searching all the parts, finding the best bits. But my last 2 computers have been, give me a good computer. Here's my budget. Did a quick search. Make sure I'm not being ripped off. Getting the best thing I can get. I don't care anymore. It doesn't matter to me as long as it's a box under my desk, which makes magic computer stuff happen. I'm happy.
That was pretty much mine. My goal was like, I need something that's gonna be fast and get here tomorrow. I was like, I need it as quick as possible, because I realized it when I went to record. I got up at Tuesday morning, turned on the computer. I was like, all right, time to record, and nope, can't record. It's like I can't do any work, so I got to get something back up and running. Anyway, ordered this thing that's over here. You can kind of loosely see, and it's up and running. And I, while I enjoy the product, I'll turn it a little bit better. I definitely like it. It's cool. Like it's nice having a pre-built system that's all done up. Definitely some big issues that I don't know how to deal with or what I'm going to do about, but I don't know. Next time, hopefully, I'll just buy a pre-built system and do it when I'm not in a rush, so I can kind of maximize the quality of the hardware and stuff. Like, for instance, things like got 16 gigs of RAM. It's got a 3090 and an i9, but 16 gigs of RAM, only 2 NVMe slots, and no Bluetooth on board.
I actually wanted the 3090. Like I built my computer relatively I bought my new computer relatively recently. And I was fully on board with getting one as well, but again, couldn't find one. So I was just like, fine, I'll take a 2080 Ti like a chump and just use that for now. So that's what I've got. At some stage, I'll upgrade. But again,
Your was my inspiration for the 3090. I was like, oh, okay, I'll as well. I got to replace this thing eventually.
To be fair, you kind of blacked out. The first set of 3090s had a bazillion issues. If you Google it, you'll find non-stop threads about them dying randomly and not booting, and etc. etc.
That's another valuable lesson I've learned. Don't be one of the first on the bandwagon. For example, in the other room, I have my older computer with dual 1080s Founders Editions. And only after I got them did I learn, oh, by the way, there's an actual hardware issue where the Founders Edition original 1080 cards only ever use about 75% of their actual capacity. It's like, oh, okay, so I've lost a ton of performance just by choosing the wrong cards. And it's not like something you can fix with a patch. It's like a hardware limitation for it overheating or something. I can't remember what the problem was, but suffice it to say, I had really good cards that wouldn't ever use their full capacity. Really annoying.
That does sound frustrating.
With the 3090, specifically the one I have and the issue it has is whenever it has to switch from low voltage to high voltage, like something in the game suddenly demands rendering something more intense really, really quick, like over a duration of 1 frame with no warning, it will pull too much electricity and kill itself. It will literally die whenever something decides, hey, I need electricity. And that's entirely random because I used it for like a week with not a single issue. I go to play one game of League of Legends, and 20 minutes in, it dies. And I'm like, okay, maybe I overclocked it wrong, maybe something went wrong, I'm trying it out without any overclocking. Works for a single game, works for another, dies. And I'm like, oh god, I hope this isn't something constant. And I start tweaking all the settings and constantly dying in games because I have to check if it works, and the only way I know it crashes is League of Legends, which is an online game. So it's not ideal, but I tried my best. And then I found out it happens in like every other game that has unlimited frame rate and is relatively low spec, which was really unexpected. Like, you'd expect the higher end games to cause the crashes, but it was the lower end ones. Left 4 Dead 2, an old game that ran perfectly fine on my 1080, and crashes the 3090. And it was very, very annoying to try and figure it out. I tried to install Docker and have something that profiles my GPU output to see if there's like a frame before it dies that I can find any stats, and nothing worked. So
to be honest, there is a precedent though for older games having issues like that. The classic one, of course, being if you're trying to play an old DOS game on a Windows PC prior to Windows 7, I think, where they added it, you would have that issue where the frame rate would be, the games weren't frame rate independent. So you'd be running a DOS game and it would start running like literally 2,000 times its original speed. And so you had to run it in like DOSBox or something just to support the fact that it like, because your computer's now too fast, right? So I guess running older games on newer hardware, stuff can go wrong, you know?
Yeah. And basically, I didn't want to be in a situation where I don't have a GPU. So like Jason, I bought another one and I got 3070. That's it's been almost a year, so I trust that they fixed most of these issues, because at the start there was a lot of mentioning about bad soldering of some parts inside these cards, and I'd like to think they solved all of that, because you can't find any threads about these issues going into the last 3 months or so. At least I haven't. And I've been checking it out, so.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope mine doesn't have any problems like that. Guess I'll find out.
Yeah.
Probably right when I go to record or encode a video. That's the other thing I haven't got to do yet, is encode a video on this GPU. Kind of excited to see the difference there.
Yeah, it will probably do just fine. The biggest memory of the 3090 is really just the graphics memory. It has 24 gigabytes compared to the 9 or so, I think the 3080 has. And that's like, yeah, you can load pretty much anything you want on there and use any compute shader you'd like for like 2 hours and take it back. So it's really nice for heavy processes of this sort. I'm not exactly sure what else uses graphics memory to that extent.
I will say one thing that is particularly fun with that is when you're doing anything, just in general, having a good computer, I guess, is certain tasks are kind of surprising. Like one that still kind of caught me off guard. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but I edit videos in Premiere, and at one stage I was just doing standard editing. And if you're editing a relatively large thing, general advice is there's a preview window. Set your preview window to like half or quarter resolution while you're scrubbing through and working. Now, I'm using this thing, which is like a modular power tool thing that lets you do fancy editing stuff easier. So from my perspective, I can spin these dials. What are those called
again, by the way?
They've changed companies. So they used to, I forgot what they're called now. Very good question. Is there a name on the back? I can't remember the company name. Monogram. They're called Monogram Controls or something. Really cool. Like, honestly, just these things, just the wheels, let you scrub through your timeline really quickly. And I can use this to zoom in or out on my anyway, the whole side topic. My point is, because I'm spinning this wheel to scrub the timeline, I'm scrubbing quite fast, faster than you would normally by just clicking around. What I was noticing was I was editing this video that's like 1080p, and it's going really slow. Like it's juddering. I'm like, hang on a second. I've literally scrubbed 4K timelines flawlessly before. Why is it suddenly lower? And then I realized it's because I had lowered the proxy to be down to whatever it was, like quarter resolution or something. So because I was setting it to a lower resolution than the video, it was having to transcode between its actual resolution to a lower resolution, and because I'm spinning the wheel so fast, there's it's small, it's stuttering. But because my computer's fast enough to render it at full speed, it's actually faster for me to edit at full resolution because my computer can handle it and it doesn't require any transcoding. So, long story short, my editing process is actively slower if I do all the advice that you're supposed to do to make your editing faster, because my computer's too good for those rules. It was ridiculous. It was just one of those moments of, okay, I've learned a new thing.
It's good to try these things out too, because when you find those optimizations by developers, it's like really nice. A lot of people don't take into consideration that turning your window bigger or smaller doesn't actually change the resolution of the video. It just changes the viewport transformation.
Or people who don't realize that there's actually a huge fundamental difference with how the computer handles full screen resolution versus full screen windowed. That it's fundamentally different to the point that it can vastly affect your performance and how your graphics card handles things. And it's worth trying both depending on the context you've got set up.
Yeah.
All right, let's get into your boundaries, Andrew and Jason. There's some issues there. You're talking about it on a stream, right? This is one of your just daily? Are they now daily streams, Andrew? How often are you doing these game development streams?
I've been doing them almost daily at this point. I think for two reasons. One, I'm trying to get to YouTube monetization, which I just reached overnight. Woohoo! Party time!
Awesome! Yay. Congratulations!
Yeah, now they just need to approve me before I've got a big cliff. Last year I had a humble bundle, so there's a big cliff of watch hours on the 12th of this month. So I'm gonna lose the threshold, I think, on that day, but that's okay. But I've been enjoying.
Go watch Andrew's stream real quick.
Yeah, I've got a stream after this too, so you can come join that. But I've been enjoying doing the stream. It's definitely I'm less efficient when I'm doing the stream because I'm talking to folks and Jason keeps coming on and giving me all these great tips. But Jason keeps coming on and giving me these great tips, and other people on the who chat and come in often. They've probe and say, hey, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? Or have you tried this? And there's some really great tips. So basically I'm doing a better job, even though I'm a little bit slower because I'm doing it live. And I think it's just fun. So I've been doing it almost daily, anywhere from 2 to 4 hours at a time, and then go out for a walk and stuff. So.
Nice.
I keep finding your videos like completely random hours for me because I don't run on a 24-hour schedule. And I keep finding it like when I wake up, when I go to sleep. It's really funny, and I always hop in and like look for a moment. But there are stuff that I want to support, of course, but I'm not exactly sure what to say. So I like
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I've hopped into like Thomas Brush when he's live coding and stuff, and the same thing. I'm like watching, like, well, this is very interesting, but at the same time, it does take a little bit of investment to understand what's going on. Or just have it as background noise. A lot of people, that's what they say. They keep it on for background noise. They're working on their own projects, and they just keep it on to listen to it.
It makes it feel like you're coding with somebody.
Yeah, so you're now in an office or something. You can hear other people talking and mumbling to themselves.
Yeah, and that's what I'm doing. But the only problem with that, just one thing, is you always have this really relaxing music to the point where I'm trying to get work done, and I'm like, oh, I'll just put Andrew's stream on the side, and then you're putting this like sleepiest music I've ever heard in my life, and it's like, oh, okay, fine. So sometimes I've had to turn your stream off just so I could put on some more energetic music. And
I need to update the music. I like having the background music. That people seem to enjoy that, so that when I don't talk, there's at least some noise, something. But it is very relaxing music.
But yeah, I guess to circle back to the topic, the idea basically is that, so again, I do my own stuff, and whenever there's a stream on, I'll put it on the side because one, I know Andrew trying to reach the watch hour count, and two, it's just something, it's background noise, as you said. And so I've kind of had a passing understanding of the project Andrew's working on and what he's doing, and every so often there's like a small, oh, here's a little line of code, or I can see you're going on a hunt to kind of go, oh, how do I solve this problem? I'm like, oh, it's just this 2-line here. But then every so often there's something which is larger than that. And it's like, oh, here's a conceptual design concept. And it's like, you shouldn't do that. And it's like, oh, why not? I'm like, okay, I'll try this thing. And then it suddenly becomes trying to have a debate in a 200-character limit over a 1-minute delay. And it's like, this is infuriating. Just trying to like speak. It feels like I'm sending Morse code messages going, this is driving me insane. And so every so often, Andrew will pull me and I can go, right, let me try to explain this concept. There's, yeah, so... Normally, as Andrew said, I don't want to disrupt too much because I do that a lot. I've noticed in streams, I've done this even with Thomas Brush, as you mentioned. Sometimes he'll do something and I'll make a comment and I'll realize I've suddenly like derailed the stream and I'm having a conversation with the streamer back and forth in the comments. I'm like, I try to avoid doing that if they're getting work done because I know you're already taking a hit of how much performance you're getting done by just streaming anyway. So you were working on this thing, and we were having a discussion previously about this concept of how would you architect a system like this and how do you solve certain problems. And there was one kind of design philosophy that I was having a really hard time explaining. And so, for anybody interested, last night we effectively, midway through the stream, I screen shared my screen and I just sort of did a mock-up example of the kind of vague architecture that Andrew was doing, and I sort of talked through a few ideas, and then I cut to my screen and I did it differently, the way I would kind of approach that thing. And again, unbeknownst to me, 2 hours I talked through this concept. So while there's no new video on my channel, you can go watch me 2 hours just design an architecture over on Andrew's at the moment. And I realized there was a topic there that wasn't particularly clear and was quite interesting. So I wanted to bring that up here and kind of relate to it because it's something I think isn't covered a lot. Which brings us to application boundaries and architectural boundaries. So
what was the system, before you get into it, that you that you were working on there, that this is all about? Give everybody a little bit of context.
So I was building basically a class to spit out average stats of a group of party members. Now, this is a party-based first-person RPG, so you got a bunch of people, and it says, what's your average luck, as the example. And then just, so, okay. Party.average luck.
Yeah, and the underlying question, comment / problem, I guess, is when you're building a system that's that complicated, you're dealing with a lot of moving parts. You're dealing with lists of players and inventories and items and stats and all this stuff. And probably the biggest conceptual problem is, how do I talk between these things? How do I get information from one, feed it to something else, and go back and forth? And there's a lot of ways to solve this problem. And it's all trade-offs, right? There's not like a direct correct answer, which tends to frustrate people. But some of them will cause more headaches down the line. Some of them let you cut corners now and you'll pay for it later. And other ones are the other way around, where it's more tedious now, but you'll get benefits later or whatever. And there's one thing which is sort of like an underlying architecture to the way Andrew's doing stuff, which works perfectly fine. Nothing wrong with it. But I'm looking at it going, I can see at some point with the kind of game that's being made, the kind of features that'll be added later, it's going to require heavy refactoring to add new features later. And I was saying this is something that you can think about now, and it might impact future decision making. You don't have to change it, but if you're aware of it, at least it's something that'll start to kind of be on your mind as you go forward. And the basic idea was there is a sort of a chained system where everything lives in the root of a concept of a game, and a game has data, and then stuff lives in the game data, and then subsequently all future stuff queries the game data to get access to things. And the bit that really stuck out to me was a violation of what's called the Law of Demeter. And that basically means whenever you write thing.thing.thing, you're sort of saying, open this box, reach into the box, take this thing, open that box, reach into that box, and get this thing. And because it's a chain, what people don't realize is that what that does is it tells me how things work. Not just that there is a connection, but the exact direct path to a certain piece of data. And that means that if that path ever changes, that chain is broken and everything falls apart on that chain. So it's kind of like hard coding a URL path in a file. If you hard code it, it works perfectly fine. It requires the least amount of complexity. But if that file ever changes, things magically break everywhere and you have to try to fix it. And so that's the same concept with this Law of Demeter idea. And so what I was saying is, in the middle of a party, a player party, in order to get the list of players, it currently goes through this concept of game.data.players internally. And so as a result of this, if you ever wanted to do some party of other players or a party and do calculations that don't involve them, you're kind of in a situation where you have to start hard coding this or working around it or writing if statements and checks and things. And the general idea I was trying to get across is limit how much work is needed to be done. So what does a party really need? A list of players. If you let it magically acquire its own list, you have to go through this master system and the party knows too much information. But if you pass in the players into the party, suddenly players can come from anywhere. And I go into this in much more detail as I build the concept of a shop and I start doing questions around wallets and inventories and players and how do these things interconnect and how do you swap one out for the other. So if you want like 2 hours of that in detail, there's the link.
Rapid fire coding. That's very quick, yeah.
It's off the cuff too. So just like, again, some people are going to look at that and go, oh, is this a recommendation for how you should do it? I make it very clear. I wasn't writing code the way you're supposed to do it. I wouldn't do it that fast that way. I wouldn't race through it. I was trying to it's like I was drawing chalkboard outlines of a house or of a street layout. I was demonstrating the relationship between elements. I would actually do it a lot slower, go through it system by system, and I would test it and build it up. So don't look at the code I was writing. I made it very clear. Look at once I kind of erased through some code, I would pause and then talk through the relationships. So don't take too much seriously from the code I wrote. Think about more the conversations I was bringing up around it. So I wanted to just highlight that. I wanted to ask Andrew if anything particular stood out, and then after that I would bring up the kind of power chord metaphor again that I was using, that I think was my favorite part of explaining that.
It's one other thing with that Law of Demeter is just not just the having all of the stuff exposed and having it being able to break easily, which is definitely one of the main things that'll happen, but also having to understand and know how the internals of each system work, which when you're building a thing all on your own and you're solo, sometimes you don't really think too much about it because the stuff is fresh in your mind and you're always there in your head. But the second you're working with another developer, or you're going to work on anything long term where you're going to come back to it later, you really want to minimize the interface there and minimize what's exposed so that it's a lot easier for you to work with and not screw up later, not have to look through your code to remember how things work anymore too. The less stuff you expose, the less and the less ways there are to do things, the less likely you are to make mistakes in the future and accidentally break shit while you're adding or fixing other features.
And I was having a really hard time explaining this kind of idea. And then Andrew asked a question that really resonated with me, which is the idea of, that makes sense and all, but aren't you just moving the problem around? Now, that really struck with me because I asked the same thing when I was first learning this stuff. And I've always had a hard time trying to explain why there is a difference. And then I came up with this metaphor example, and I think it finally gets to the heart of the problem, which is if you have a kettle plugged into the wall, what's the difference between that and wiring the kettle to the wall? If you look at that on the surface, it's exactly the same. They both get power from the wall. They're both connected. You can still use it. If you just arbitrarily put a plug between the kettle and the wall, what's the difference? Literally nothing changes for you as a user of a kettle, you as an owner of a house. It's pointless. Why would you ever not just wire it directly into the wall? Well, a lot of people make the mistake of thinking, oh, it's about over-engineering. You don't need that stuff. Well, the way I look at it, if it's wired to the wall, the problem isn't the fact that it's wired. The problem is at some point that'll change. Software always changes. You can't rely on it being static. Some part of that will change. And if a device is wired directly into the wall, you can change it. It's not like forever stuck like that. But if you do change it, you have to temporarily break it to change it. So in this case, in order to separate it from the wall, you either have to break the wall, the wiring, or you have to break the kettle. So in order to make a change, you have to risk a break and then possibly fix what you've done. If there's a plug and something breaks, or you want to take it apart, you unplug it, you plug something else in. So it may be the same thing, but the outcome is your ability to change it is now vastly increased, and you've got this psychological safety of what you can do with it, because it's, you can comfortably unplug it, mess with the kettle, and then plug it back in or not, up to you. And if you, for example, want to experiment, say you wanted to change a kettle for a toaster, if it was plugged in, you would have to cut the cable, attach a toaster, see if you liked it. If you change your mind, you would have to undo the whole thing again and then cause more breaking changes just to get back the previous state you had before. The alternative is, if it's a plug socket, you could plug in a kettle, unplug it, plug in the toaster, change your mind, plug back in the kettle. So the concept of a boundary line isn't just academically looks nice, and it's not about feature changes, because it's exactly the same. That's 100% right. You should theoretically get the same features if it's wired in versus if it's a plug. But what you do get is the ability to think about them separately. And it also means that when someone designs a kettle, They don't have to go to your house and measure the wall and check the cable depth and all that, because it's got nothing to do with your house. It's to do with the socket, a unified shared contract. So if you wanted a concept of high scores in your game, you can make high scores and say, what's a high score? Well, if I give you a name and a number, put it somewhere, and then if I ask for the list of all of the current numbers and names, give me that back, you've come up with a shared contract, and then anybody can design a new kettle. They can go off and make one that goes to Google, one that goes to Steam, one that goes to some web service, one that goes to PlayFab, and the contract you have with the rest of the world is that socket. And so they never need to see your code or vice versa. You don't have to specifically write a piece of code that says, how do I interface with this exact contract in this exact wall or whatever. So yeah, that seemed to me to be a valuable way to explain a relatively complex topic. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Entirely agreed. Perfect way. 100 mark. One very nice benefit once you start getting used to not breaching boundaries is that you can reap a lot of benefits without any real rewriting of your things, because you know this is all it takes and this is all it does, and you don't have to start changing your contracts just because you want to add a new feature to it, because everything has the clear boundary. You take electricity, do stuff. And if you want to do a new thing, you don't have to go new thing dot thing at the end of the cable, do stuff, because you have the clear boundary at the socket.
And I think the other part of that too, which I hopefully demonstrated at the end of that stream, was it gives you a lot of creative freedom. So when I was playing around at the very end, I was coming up with silly ideas. If we have an inventory and stuff, I said, well, what if you send the products to your horse, or you have a sorting goblin who sorts your out? Like, it doesn't matter, because the whole point is that I've drawn a very clear line. And I think a good example of this, to go back to the power analogy, is if you have a device that uses USB power, whether it's an alarm clock or a smartwatch or some other device that can be charged with a USB cable, you probably never thought of the idea of a car charger adapter that connects to a USB cable that lets you charge it from the lighter socket on a car, right? Or you've got people who have fans that can be hand cranked to generate power. The idea is that if you use a contract, people can come up with really wacky versions that support that contract, that can add features that you never conceived of at the time of creating it. And if you don't use a contract, you're kind of limited to the rules you've set in place to start. Like with a high score table, imagine somebody had some really convoluted system where you actually sent it to, it's not a high score table at all, but all the scores get printed out using some WebSocket connection that goes to a 3D printer and then literally engraves it on the wall in wood or something. It could be literally anything, because the relationship between your scoreboard system and your code is, here's some names, go do something with it, right? You've not actually ever said print to a file or go to a website or go to whatever. So it kind of becomes really powerful later when you realize you have some really wacky idea that's well beyond the scope of the original code you designed. And you're like, oh, I just plug in a different thing. Nothing changes. The contract is still exactly the same. In the case of the kettle, I want a thing that generates power. If you want a big, I don't know, neon sign that says cocktail lounge or something on it, you could plug that in where the kettle used to be and nothing changes. You don't ever have to add a port or write some code to support a really unique and different use case than previously existed.
Yeah, and when you mentioned that you can do things that are well beyond the scope of the original problem, one thing that comes to mind is wrappers and splitting the task to other possible task takers. Because using the electricity example, you can make both an extension cord but a splitter that just has more things that need electricity. And you don't breach any contract anymore. You don't need to change the functionality of everything and how it works, because you just say, hey, connect to socket, and then give electricity to more things with your own sockets.
And a very practical example of that would be AI or something, because people often ask the question of how do you have AI versus players and have both. Well, a mistake I guess I'd say is that people make is they write code inside of their character saying, if I press up, move character up. And it's like, well, why are you making that distinction that forever and all eternity you have to press up to control the player. What you're really saying is if should go up, go up. And then one version of that is if I press up, should go up. If I press down, should go down. If you do that, you could say, here's a random dice roll mover, and depending on a dice roll, pick up, down, left, right, and move in that direction. Or here's a smart AI mover that decides you should move relative to your distance to the nearest food source or whatever. You can completely change the behavior of a character to be AI driven or randomly driven or remotely controlled. Imagine having some connection where your friend can log in and control that player, and you don't have to rewrite code to support what is conceivably far out of the scope of the original thing. And it's the difference between realizing input isn't static. Input doesn't mean this keyboard here plugged into my computer right now. It means something that boils down to an up, down, left, right. And if you can draw that line at the start, you never have to think about it again, and you get all of that extra freedom later.
Yeah, one of the things that, gained my head wrapped around this concept that I realize is a lot of the prior education about how to do things doesn't use that concept. And it's much more like, hey, you're going to learn how to do this one thing, so do this, this, this. And then in our head, I think, okay, great, it works. I'm going to use that over and over and over again. That's a great concept. I'm going to keep using that. And then you get to this point where suddenly, oh no, now you shouldn't be using it because of this other reason that I haven't learned yet. And I'm like, oh shit, what? And that's where now my head has to go and kind of reverse the way I've been doing things, to thinking like, okay, well, here's the situation. All I need now is the party's average luck value. That's all I need. So let me just create this party thing, and this party will spit out anything I need from the party. And of course, the better thing is to create a class that spits out the average of any group of player objects, and then pass that in is what I'm gathering from this, so that it's the same result in the end, but now I can pass in any group of players. Could be bad guys, could be good guys, could be the entire world, whatever it might be, and it will spit out the exact same result without having that hard-coded to be this group of 4 player objects.
Right. Yeah,
and it's just a different way of... Yeah.
It is a different way of thinking, and I think a distinction that needs to be made too is a lot of people misunderstand what I'm saying to say, make everything super abstract forever and you're fine. And but it really, there's a huge difference between making something abstract and making something clear as a boundary. What I mean by this is, if you write in a function, if input dot press dot get button down fire 1, that's perfectly fine. You don't need to change it. That's okay. The problem is once you write, okay, if key up do this, if key down do this, if key left do this, if key right do this, if spacebar do this, and if press R do this, you've gotten to the point now where you've established interacting with the keyboard is a concept. It is a concept that exists, but what it's really doing is it's hiding something else, which is somebody can control this thing. And I'm not saying go and make some super possible input providing system with 50 classes. I'm saying your code is already telling you you've talked to the concept of input like 5 times. You've established input providing is a thing. It's its own concept. And if you draw a box around that and say, instead of up, down, left, right, space, whatever, if you just say should move left, should move up, should move down, should move right, and you make one implementation of that called keyboard-based movement, and you hand keyboard-based movement to your thing, everything's still the same. All you've done is move it one layer out. It's not a huge extra ordeal, but you've now said there's a difference between my intent, which is deciding if I should move, versus my implementation, which is I use a keyboard to decide if I should move. And by just drawing that one line, you can then move on. But when the time comes later that you would like to add gamepad support, you don't have to go in and go, right, I have to Control F, refactor, change every one of these lines from input.getKeyDown to gamepad.whatever or rewired.whatever or new input system.whatever. You'd have to go in and physically edit the code. And that's what the open close principle is about. You would have to risk breaking changes, or to go back to our metaphor, cut the cable in the wall to decide to move from keyboard to gamepad. But had you drawn that line once, it's not that much extra code. It's not about making some big system. You just draw a line. You just say, this thing needs 4 checks. Should I move? Should I shoot? Should I whatever? this is how I do it, you can then come back later and go, oh, I now want to change how that happens. Let's make a gamepad input provider. And it's one change. And it's one change that's undoable instantly. It's an if statement. If it's this, do this. If it's this, do this. And that gives you the freedom forever to go back to the old way whenever you want, to add a new one whenever you want, or to make up a completely different thing later. But you don't have that freedom if you don't draw that boundary line. So, again, very subtle difference. It's not about building a system that supports everything. It's about establishing that you've already made a rule. You may not have thought about it, but there is a contract. You've already established it. You just haven't named it and given it its own class. You have said, there is thing, and the thing moves with input. Or there is thing, I log information about it. Or there is thing, I save its stuff and I get its stuff back. There is some external rule, and the implementation doesn't really matter, but there's a relationship there. And if you draw the relationship, you can then change that implementation.
Yeah. The comments are actually mentioning about still having to decide whether you want to be generic up front or whether you should try and resolve it after the fact. And in my own opinion, you start with the code that you need, not code that you don't. You can't predict all the problems that are there from the beginning, but if you invest some time at the beginning to think about it, if you see the problem, sure, go ahead and abstract it. Because when we talk about input, you know that you want the keyboard to do it. And if that's the only thing you'll ever want, sure, write the keyboard code right there and then. But then if you know that maybe you'll want the gamepad and maybe you want on-screen buttons for touch and etc., you'll start to see very quickly, without a lot of effort, that maybe there is a benefit to putting something generic. Don't pay the cost up front. If you do need to pay it later, just make sure you do it after the first solution. So you don't have to go and do if this, else that, and then swap them both for something else. You're paying the cost 3 times instead of 2, sometimes even just once, depending on how many references you have. Yeah. Because if all the reference was keyboard and you switch it to I give input, it's really not that big a deal.
Yeah, totally agree. Write the code that you need, and then once you're ready for that first abstraction, or if you know for sure that you're going to have the abstraction, then you know you need it. But if you're not sure you need it, keep it to just what you need to make it work, and then extend it out and extract it. But make sure, like Yari said, to do it as soon as you do the first one. Like you make the second input system. Don't fill it up with a bunch of ifs. Actually abstract it out and make it work, right?
And I would say one thing that I think is the biggest indicator of somebody getting confused about this concept, and this is from personal experience. I spent 2 years doing this, and it only finally clicked for me afterwards, and I'm very frustrated how obvious it is in retrospect. The problem when you start doing this contract-based stuff is you start going, but what's the right contract? I have input. I don't know what inputs I need. Do I need space bars? Do I need keyboard? Do I need to reload button or whatever? And so you start sitting down and trying to architect the perfect boundary line that covers every possible input that ever might go across. Don't do that. Don't ever even go down that road. What you do instead is, and this comes back to the test-driven development philosophy. We're not going to go into that right now, but there is a term from that that's valuable to know, and it's called Green Refactor. And it basically means, at first, it doesn't work. If you said, when I press spacebar, it shoots a gun, well, you haven't written the code yet, so it doesn't work. So it's red. Nothing exists. Nothing works. Then you write the code that makes it work. It turns green. When I press spacebar, it now fires. The line of code might literally be if input.get button down, fire 1, physics.raycast, something. That could be what it does. You can stop there and go, this works. This does it. I've written exactly the code I need. But what am I saying? I'm really saying, if should shoot, shoot. The implementations don't matter, but the intent there is if I should shoot, do a shoot. And if you just say, if should shoot, do shoot, you haven't really done much, but you've already established should shoot can change. It can be anything. And then what shoots can change. Now, you don't have to change it now, but just by doing that one separation, you've given yourself the freedom that when the time comes to change input, it can be something else. And if you want to switch from raycast to spawning spheres or something, you have a place to do it in the shoot function. You've dedicated the difference between the intent of things that shoot go here to what actually happens when that happens. So don't pre-extract, just be sort of clear about your intent versus the code you're writing.
Yeah.
Seems like good advice. There was
actually a lot of...
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to read off this question about it. It says, is it harder to make something abstract later while working with a team on a large project? So you're like, and it says because then it may be used in many places in different ways. And I think that the answer from me at least is that everything is harder when you're working on a large team project. But I haven't found that refactoring something that people are using has been any harder than refactoring something that's somewhat relatively new, because usually the refactor includes making a default implementation that does exactly what you're already doing. So you're just kind of like abstracting out some of the stuff down to a base class and leaving a lot of that normal implementation there, or the existing implementation there, and then switching it as needed, only in the places where you need it. But you generally keep the base working version there so that everything else is still working as you abstract that out. At least in my experience. But I was curious what you guys thought about that. Have you had to like abstract or refactor stuff with a relatively large project? I assume you have.
Yeah, I was just ranting to Jason about it a while ago. I had to refactor something that had 180 references around source code. Oh, hey!
Hello.
Hello.
I'm just testing to see how loud my background is here. See how long
Pretty
it's
loud.
Yeah, sorry.
So going back to the question, when you refactor something, you're basically saying the way this was written isn't how it's supposed to be written. Let me quickly change how that works. And usually people already wrote what they need when you're working in a group project and you're deciding this needs to change. So unless at the moment they're working with this exact system, nothing is going to happen when you do your refactor. If there are more references, sure, that's a bit more work, but you already know that you need this to happen and you don't want it to get worse. So there isn't much to say against doing it in a big team. You don't have to make the perfect decisions, never even try, because you'll only build up God systems that are too complex for you to remember 3 months down the line.
In fact, actually, when it comes to refactoring, you should make boundary lines. So if you're given this horrible mess of code that's not yours from somewhere else and you want to make it work better and you want to clean it, if you try to clean it, you see like public global static things that shouldn't be there, or you're like, oh, I'm suddenly like giving access to this information that shouldn't be there, and you try to make it private, a whole load of crap might break because somebody somewhere that you don't know might be requiring that one piece of information. Or a classic example that I guarantee every programmer at some stage has seen, there's a spelling mistake somewhere in the code. You think you're being a good Boy Scout by changing the spelling mistake to correct it, and something breaks because somebody is relying on it being the incorrect spelling somewhere because somebody has too much information about a system that they shouldn't really have. And you might find yourself going, oh, I don't even want to touch this. If I change something, it's my fault, I break it, and people are going to shout at me somewhere, and I don't want to deal with that problem. So what the solution is, you make that contract. You say, okay, what do I think the rest of the world is doing talking to this system? And so you draw a box around it and say, the only piece of information people should be getting out of this system is this, this, and this. And then you wrap the box around it, you hide everything inside of it, and you see what breaks. You see who's breaking the contract. And then you fix that stuff separately. If you have to do some weird hack to get around it and give those guys global access to stuff they shouldn't, fine, just do it for now. And suddenly you've got a clean box where you know everything only talks to this contract. Now you can safely refactor the hell out of everything in the box because the box now has an outgoing thing. And what you can do is you can make a fake version where it's like, is able to buy product could just return true. For now, it always returns true, whatever. Now I'll just start cleaning this code because you've now made a boundary line where you're safe to do that refactor. If you don't put the boundary line in, every single line you change could break somebody else's code somewhere. So adding contracts doesn't make it harder to refactor. It makes it easier, providing you're aware that what you're doing is you're like cordoning off an area so you can safely clean it. That's kind of the point, you know?
Yeah. There's actually a funny case I have for deciding on a good way to refactor things. In Terraria, we have this localization system where we actually extract the IDs of everything from a class file into keys that we can use in a JSON-based serialization for every localization for every language. So what I mean is we have a public static item ID class, and every item is a constant int item ID name. So item ID Zenith. And then something looks at the class using reflection, finds all the names, and checks for the key in our JSON files if we have anything in the localization system. Now, this is a leak in the implementation because what we have is the keys have to perfectly match the item ID name. If somebody wants to refactor the ID, everything breaks. And basically, if you do things in a way that prevents this kind of change breaking everything, you can save yourself some work from the cases Jason mentioned.
Jason drop out. So do you have a good solution for that? Or what would you recommend instead of that?
Well, so you can put a key on every item definition, then it can control what it has. You might have some duplication of the code, but you can decide on other elegant ways to solve that specific problem. The main thing is you didn't have a concrete binding, and somebody decided, hey, this is exposed, I am going to look at this, and then if anything ever changes with it, my code will break. And you don't want that situation specifically.
I faced a small version of that, literally with a misspelled thing with my item system, where I was naming the various attributes and items, and one was misspelled, and I fixed the misspelling, and then everything broke because I was exactly doing that. Even though I wasn't typing it in, I was linking things via their name. And then as soon as the name changed, all these other things that had copies of this item suddenly didn't match. And so I realized I needed to have a unique ID per item so that all the other bits and pieces can change. It doesn't matter what I change on those. It's always going to refer back to the exact same item no matter where it lives, because that one unique ID technically won't change.
Yeah. I actually remember being on the stream when that happened.
That was a fun one, yeah.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to say, actually, in that time, in Unity, you can use Scriptable Objects existence. It comes with its own unique identifier. So you can actually make a data object that is the item identifier or the item itself, and you can use those as a drop-in that you cannot screw up as you work with your things. Like this field is supposed to show this item in its slot instead of this item string, and you're saving yourself having to match all the strings ever as you work with the project. I've actually done this to some extent in my own pet projects. I've made a stat identifier scriptable object, and then when I want an item to add stats, I actually have a drop-in for this scriptable object and this much. And then I can't ever screw up stat IDs. And if I wanted to, and people wanted to mod the game, they can actually make a new instance of a stat identifier. And now the game supports custom stats on everything without any issues, which is something I try to pay a lot of attention to, how easy a game is to mod, in what ways are you blocked when you try to add content. Because in Terraria, I got to see that people want to change a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think for any game, the ability to mod is one of those things that seems to me, looking at it from the outside at least, to be a multiplier of demand, where suddenly if people can mod something, not only are you changing the game so now they can do more with your game than you intended, but now they're bringing in other people by saying, hey, I modded it, come check it out, come check it out, come check it out, rather than just saying, I'm playing a game, come check it out, which is, I think, less of a demand than saying, I made something new with this game, see how cool it is, and now come check it out. I think being able to mod games is probably going to increase revenue for indie games.
It's amazing from a code design perspective what can be a blocker for modders. One of the most famous examples of this is one of the most modded games in the world is Minecraft. And the original Minecraft, one of the biggest issues you had to overcome as a modder or a mod creator is there's an item count limit. Items have IDs. There's a maximum number of IDs available. All the IDs are hard coded to be specific items and blocks. And so the way you had to deal with that problem is you had to override existing IDs. And see another example of this. If you ever mod an existing game, like take Mario 64 on N64, if you mod that, the way you traditionally mod it is you actually override a level. You can't manifest a new level, but what you can do is override the contents for an existing level and then redirect them to that content. And so in the case of IDs, one of the first mods to come out that was really popular for Minecraft was just an item ID manager. So the first mod people made really was a thing that lets you override the way Minecraft handled IDs so that you could install other mods and queue up the IDs. Otherwise, mod 1 could use 31 to represent some new weapon, and then some other mod could be 31, could be a certain kind of block. You can't install both mods or they break. So the ability to mod the system to better mod it started to become a big deal. And so these things start to become harder to think about. So yeah, it's very interesting to see where the limits will be. And if you just treat it with an abstract contract of save item, get item ID, you've solved that problem in perpetuity, right? That's kind of the point of a contract. It lets you say, items go in, items come out. I've now solved that problem. I don't need to hard code it, you know?
Yeah.
So you've been using Unity for a little while now. Are you using a lot of scriptable objects, Yari?
I use scriptable objects for everything that I manage without state. I am very opinionated on my stance that scriptable objects should never hold state unless they are made for runtime only purposes. I don't like something to hold both data that is authored in the editor out of play mode and execution state that is only used in runtime. When you mix these up, I find that you end up with catastrophic failures with how the flow of the code works. At least personal opinion. But.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I like them a lot for content stuff. Sometimes I like them for inter-game communication for events and sending messages around and stuff. But I definitely don't like them for any like long-term persisted state. If stuff's going to be persisted, I don't want it in there. I don't mind like saving something off there and reading it from somewhere else that's runtime, but yeah, not for saving off my character stuff. I know that I've seen a lot of examples that show kind of doing that, saving off all of your stuff in there and then kind of writing it out. And I've even done videos on how to do it. It's just not the way that I prefer to do it. It is a simple way to save stuff off. But like I said, it tends to fall apart as it gets bigger.
Well, I actually did make a system where I save the character off into a scriptable object, but the character save class itself was serializable and not a scriptable object. The scriptable object just held it because I don't need to have all the baggage of scriptable object class creation and validation over a simple character save.
Yeah, the enterprise version of this is something called Redis. It's effectively in-memory data, and a good way to look at this would be I think I've used this metaphor before, but if you have this giant bookshelf behind you and there's 5 bits of information you check regularly, say there's a certain page in a certain book you want to check on a semi-regular basis, it's a lot of work to go to the shelf, get the thing, find it, grab it, and look at the page ID. And the equivalent for a save file is you don't have to like read a text file, scrub through all the lines, and find a single piece of data every time you want to just read it and look at it and, change some values. So if you instead do the equivalent of move it to a simpler box to play with, which is take the file, read the data, put it in the counter beside you, and have a smaller version of it here, you can play with this all you like. And then when time comes to save it back, you can then put it back on the shelf. And so I use Scriptable Objects for that same purpose, which is here's a box closer to me. It's like an in-memory little thing. So I read the real data, the one in the file, into the Scriptable Object. I can play with a Scriptable Object all I want, and then at some point I click a save button and it takes a scriptable object and then throws it back on the shelf. That keeps the two ideas separate.
Yeah. If we're talking about scriptable objects in other bigger extents, one thing I tend to be very careful of, even with the runtime scriptable objects, is to not put them on anything that is going to be instanced more than well, the data object that stores it, because scriptable objects are assets, and if you're saying double this asset at runtime, you already lost the entire benefit of having it, because the one that you generated at runtime is going to be manually bound to everything. And if you manually bound a class or a scriptable object asset, where's the difference? You don't see the scriptable object asset in the editor if you generated it at runtime. You gain nothing from taking the scriptable object baggage when you do that. But
and I would say this is one thing that I didn't want to bring up with Andrew too much, because there's a level where I don't mind suggesting things that are small fixes, but when something's a core part of your system, I don't want to derail you on a certain thing. But one of them that comes to mind a lot is you do a lot of copying lists to maintain parity between them. And that's kind of what your eyes was talking about there, is the idea that you fall into a weird category where in order to solve the problem that lists can be out of sync, you've had to write other code to synchronize and maintain state between multiple lists. And that can get into a weird infinite scaling problem. And usually, as a general rule, you're better off if you can find a way to have a source of truth that's shared between multiple things rather than having to rely on copying, sharing, and persisting multiple lists. But that's a very fundamental change. And I was trying to reason about a quick way that might be fixed or changed, and there's no way to change something that large in a system. Something like logging, we can just like draw that box and fix it. But something like object list copying and cloning and persisting, that would be like a huge ordeal, and it's not really worth tackling a thing like that. But it is something to note that as a general rule, it's usually a good idea not to copy and try to maintain separate variants of the same list, but rather to have a place where you say, get me stuff, and it's the one place of the stuff, you know?
Yeah. Actually, on that note, when I mentioned using the assets for a singular thing that I'm not going to generate at runtime, the asset gets to keep the source of truth when it's the runtime scriptable object, and then everything can just refer to it and say, hey, whenever the contents of truth change, just tell me and I'll adapt. So one example I have is actually when was it 2 weeks ago, Jason? I helped making a project in Photon trying to display something.
That might have been 3 or 4. God, it's been so long. I have to actually get back to that. That's something that's still on my to-do list. I actually have to do that by Wednesday this week. So anyway, separate topic.
So I tried to make a small minimalistic project for JSON, and on the way I decided I'll use a scriptable object to say, hey, this thing in the UI was selected. Whenever this thing in the UI's selection changes, let other things know, and they can then say, sure, recalculate what I'm doing and show it. And this is kind of the thing with the lists that I find myself doing a lot. Basically a register to say, hey, I want to know what's your source of truth, and when it changes, register me. And then the register function will go say, okay, you should call your recalculation right now, and also I'll let you know whenever I change again. And that's kind of a solution to maintaining synchronized lists as one source of truth.
Yeah, and I find a lot of people look at things like event systems and say, ugh, that sounds heavy, having to have events everywhere, and every time something changes, firing an event. It's like, that's one way to look at it. But if you had something which was changing every frame, sure, firing an event every frame is costly. But like, if you have something which changes every couple of seconds even, how many times would that fire if it wasn't an event versus only when it changes? And if you start to see your project as two completely discrete, separate things, stuff that is always happening, like gravity, and stuff that happens sometimes, like a player gets hit, you can start to realize there's a very clear separation there. And even if you're firing events hundreds of times, that's still less than thousands of update frames, right? So it is worth thinking about in terms of things like lists. Lists aren't changing every frame, usually, unless you're like grabbing a list of things that are raycasted or something. Predominantly a list is, here is the state of things. Oh, something died, something was spawned, something was dropped, something was picked up. These are isolated events. And so having some system which basically says, there's a new thing now, a thing is gone now, a thing has changed now, means that all the rest of the code becomes simpler. There's no polling, there's no checking, there's no querying, there's no duplicating and sharing stuff. There's just a question, which is, hey, let me know when this happens. As for how you do that, there's lots of patterns. In my case, I'm a fan of something called a view model with a notify property change handler. Whole different conversation, but it's effectively, if there's a thing which changes, it can tell other people that it changed, and you can register for that thing's changes. There's even built-in version of this. There's something called an observable collection, which is basically a list of things where every time the list changes, it'll let you know. Now, there's reasons to not use that relative to serialization and stuff, but the point is, this is such a pervasive idea. There are built-in solutions for a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, observable collection's a pretty good one to know about. But you got to remember that it's only for adding and removing items from the collection, not for when they change. So as long as you only need to deal with that, it kind of handles those events automatically for you when an item's added or removed.
And if you want, like, my personal solution for dealing with and changing too, it's a bit hacky, but it works, is if you have a class and it extends from collection, the type collection, that's an abstract base class, system.collection, that you can just write your own implementation of handling collection items. And so what I do is I would create my own type that would extend from collection and then override the handler function for when an item is added. Then I would have a T, the generic contract, where I'd say must implement I notify property changed, and on added to the collection, I would subscribe to the notify property change, and then I could fire events, and I could write my own, which says I have changed. Now, I can fire an event when the object's added, when it's removed, and when an object that's been added fires his event that says I've changed, I can then grab the ID to that and fire an event that says a thing in the list has changed. Suddenly, you have a super collection which lets you know if anything at all remotely related to that list changes. It's a bit of legwork to get there, but you end up with a collection that sort of smartly updates you whenever anything interesting happens. And that's suddenly a lot more efficient than ever having to do constant update loops and checks and whatever. You just have a list of stuff where and I do this, for example, I had a notice board full of people's faces in Photon, which is like who's talking, who's here at the moment, who's readied up on a certain thing. And having a notified collection means if somebody changes their ready status, I don't have to say, oh, let me just check all users and which one's ready and who's ready now but wasn't ready last time. I can just say, if anybody changes their current, like, 2 or 3 properties associated with them, let me know, and I will redraw the UI as a result. So there's some really interesting use cases that simplify the code later, but again, you have to write a lot of code to get there, which can be a bit frustrating.
Yeah, entirely agreed. One thing I wanted to bring up when Jason Weimann, you mentioned not tracking when the contents of something change. Something very dangerous with lists and Unity is game objects, or rather Unity objects in general, can be destroyed, but the references are still touched by everything. And a lot of people don't seem to know that, but Unity has an implicit Boolean operator for an object. So you can say, if something, make that something do whatever. And I find that a lot of people compare against null instead, and you should really not do that. The implicit bool operator does that for you and also checks the more sensitive C++ based underlying code.
And for a reference to that, Andrew, remember when I pointed out before, you said thing equals null, and I said you can just put ! thing instead? That was doing all of that magic behind the scenes for you.
Yes, and I think and I've been doing that more, probably not all the time, but more. And to your point, Uri, is I did no idea why. You know, to me, the way I saw it, I was like, oh, they're the exact same thing. It's just less text if I just say !
Yeah, so if you actually are interested in how this works, you can actually check the Unity CS reference GitHub project, which will show you exactly what happens as you go through the Boolean implicit operator. But the baseline is you use that to check if the object has been destroyed, which there is no convenient method to say was destroyed. You have to check the Boolean operator, and that's something that took a while to get used to. It's incredibly frustrating, especially when you iterate over a list of something that is a Unity object, and now you have to check if the thing in the list is already destroyed or not for every single part of the iteration, for every iteration ever, which is why I don't like maintaining lists in Unity objects at all.
And
well, I don't like destroying objects.
yeah, exactly. If you can get away with that, that's even better. One upshot of this, though, that's very important to note is so the kind of the subtext here is that the concept of equality in Unity is more complicated than it seems. And if you dive down into the chain of this, you realize saying is thing there or is thing null actually results in a lot of checks. Is it still alive? Is it there? Is the content there? Has the content been destroyed? Is like, and you start to go down through what even is equal? What does that mean in the concept? Is it equal to another thing? Is it equal to a thing of the same type? And so a lot of code is being ran. And that can be really useful to automate that magic for you. But if you, for example, have an update loop and your first check is if not thing, you're not just doing a thumbs up, thumbs down check. You're actually doing this like entire sea of validations and comparisons and value type comparisons and all sorts of stuff that you don't realize you're doing because it's magically hidden away from you. But what most of the time you're doing is you're really just trying to say, can I still use this thing? And so a general bit of advice for something where whenever you're doing null checks on Unity objects in an update loop, you don't need to do the null checks that often. What you need to do is, in the case of like set object, if I had a camera system with a target, I could say set target. When the target exists, I can do a null check there and set a Boolean thumbs up or thumbs down to say has target, does not have target. Now in my update, I could say if doesn't have target, move on. And so now no checks need to be done. What's happening in update is just a thumbs up or thumbs down check. It's not doing all of the equalities and events and all that stuff. That only happens when the object changes way over there when I set a new object to it. So it's worth noting that using equality isn't a true false statement. It is a series of calculations. Not too bad, but in an update, not a good idea. So whenever you find yourself using null checks in update, ask yourself how often does the thing change? And in the case of targets or selected objects or whatever, it's probably not changing very often. Or in the case of like a pooling system, you're probably only pooling, like you're setting the objects at the start of the pool and then you're doing pooling stuff. You shouldn't be doing update style checks of if, is the thing still there? Is it still there? Is the template still there? Okay, it's still there. It's still there. It's still there. You're doing all of this checks. And what you're really saying is check it once, turn a light bulb on or off, and then check the light bulb from now on. You don't need to go down through all the complexity of that later. It's a very nuanced thing and hard to explain all of the details to it, but suffice it to say, if you're doing something that actually is more complicated than you think, boil it down to a checkbox, and that'll make your life easier later.
Yeah, and actually,
go ahead. I wanted to share something after.
Actually, about checkbox, because you mentioned the update in Unity, you can actually enable and disable the component entirely if it does nothing but update, and that saves you calling empty update checks with returns.
I would even argue you shouldn't be doing the updates if you can at all. Another thing too, I mentioned before, I don't know if people notice this, but if you use awake start and update, these are called lifecycle methods. They're things which hook into the life cycle of a mono behavior. If you don't have any, you may not notice this, but the checkbox isn't there. If you have a script and you delete all the updates, all the awakes, and all the starts, there's no checkbox because the script doesn't do anything that has a life to it. It's just code in a thing. And if possible, scripts that have no life cycle don't have to be checked for running, easier to work with. So yeah, those, if possible, don't actually update in multiple mono behaviors. Just have code that does stuff, and then one thing that updates that aggregates the others and does stuff.
I remember having to do that back in the old iPhone 1 days just for performance because the CPU was so slow. Having to knock all the updates down and then farm out the stuff, or I guess manually control the updates in there. There were something else though with this null checking that I just wanted to mention because it's been something that I recently was looking at and something that hit a long time ago. I remember the first time I saw it. But before I do, I wanted to make sure that everybody remembers to hit the thumbs up button and share the stream again. If you haven't done that yet, probably should because it helps a lot and it makes me smile. But when it comes to checking for null, you're talking about checking it in a loop. There's one situation where I still think you may need to end up checking those things. And that's when you're running something on that code that's doing something that you're not going to have complete control over. I've run into situations in the past where like I'm running through something in a loop and it's firing off a game event or not a game, a Unity event. And in there, the designers or in some other system, something else is destroying the object from that code running. So we needed to check afterwards to just make sure, hey, is this object still alive or was it destroyed as a result of executing its code? Because sometimes somebody else on your team or a designer ends up doing exactly that. So it's one of the things I'd watch for, like if you're going through and you probably, hopefully, won't run into this scenario too often, but if you do, it's something to be aware of that sometimes things can be not null, and then you fire off an event and then they're null, right? One other situation though that it reminded me of was back when I first started looking at big code on a big project. This was, I think it was on Vanguard in some of the character code. I don't remember the exact details, but there were a couple spots where NPCs or entities that were players, I think it was just the player entities, were checking themselves for null. So like they would be in their own code and just there would be random spots. If this equals null, return. Like if this equals null, and it'd be like halfway through a function, you'd be like, how the hell could this thing become null? And come to find out that they were just exactly the same kind of situation where other things were getting fired off as a result of code above. They were way down, many events driven, or many events firing off and stuff, and then causing the thing to get destroyed, or network events that were on another thread causing the thing to get destroyed throughout. And it was really, I remember the first time seeing it thinking like, what in the hell is this? But yeah, I don't know. I just thought it was interesting.
That's like the fear of anybody who's ever done threaded code, is when you're like, oh, within the same line of code, in the same like 3 lines, one after another, do something, get a thing, use the thing, use the thing. It's like, wait a minute, it was there that minute, it wasn't there that minute. What the hell happened? There are 2 lines of code running one after another. Nothing changed. How did the object cease to exist between those? Oh, because you're not in control of it. Over here in parallel, someone's just, YOLO deleting stuff on you, and it's like,
Right,
okay,
overwriting your memory, deleting it.
I have to check every line. Is it still there? Do a thing. Is it still there? Do it. It starts to get really exhausting. So yeah, I think the first time I ever did threading code, that put the fear into me to always be aware of exactly that problem.
The first time I saw it, I thought, like, who the hell wrote this? This doesn't make sense. This can't even happen. I had no idea. Like, when I first started out, I had no idea all the kinds of crazy stuff that could be going on in the background.
And actually, on a side note, sorry.
It's also It's also prominent on games with heavy event invocations. For example, in Diablo, you can shoot a projectile that explodes all the enemies, and the enemies all spawn another thing, etc., etc. But halfway across the damage check, where you've called all these events, you also destroy yourself, maybe because some enemy deflected your projectile and created a new one, and suddenly halfway across your loop, you are in an invalid index because the projectiles count changed in your internal list. That's actually something really nice with enumerators. They will stop and tell you, hey, the collection size changed. Don't do that.
Yeah, and that's a whole different thing about reverse for loops and why they're important. We'll actually come back to that. It's probably useful to cover. But just before that, I was actually going to bring up, talking about the concept of things being nulled. I was actually going to bring this up because you mentioned events. At some stage, we might get to that code reviewed code for the racer thing. That's one of my notes, was using the action keyword as an event without using the event keyword. And one of the side effects of that is the fact that in the current system, in that example code, you can literally have somebody else grab an object and null out its events and throw exceptions externally from the object because it's not guarded against someone overriding the action. So that's something that we can probably get to later.
Do you want a screen share and maybe we can just dive into that a little bit? We didn't get time to go and do a full code review, but I think we could at least talk a little bit about the code that's been submitted. There are a couple people submitted code, and I sent some over to Jason, and he's had a chance to look at some. I haven't had a chance to look at any of them yet because barely got my system running. But I figured, yeah. Are you able to pop
I could, up? But whenever I do, though, again, my screen resolution is set too low. It'll eat my bandwidth. So if someone else shares, it's easier because I can talk about it with their resolution will make it clearer.
Okay. Well, why don't you talk about it, and I will slowly pull it up in the background.
Yeah, I've written down some names of particular classes and stuff that's interesting to talk about.
It's going to take me a minute to pull it up because I'm slow.
While he's doing that, what I was talking about with the reverse for loop, it's an interesting thing that's very confusing the first time you see it. One thing we were talking about earlier is deleting objects, and a thing you can get into that can be really confusing is when you've got 10 items and you're going through them and deleting certain ones. So if whatever, delete this object. You don't really think about it, but what you're doing is you're counting heads. If you have 10 people lined up and you're saying first person, second person, third person, fourth person, and you're going through it, if you were to sort of delete or remove a person from that list as you go, you're saying person 1, person 2, person 3, remove person 3, person 4 takes over person's 3 slot. You're like person 4, person 5. And if you're working with that assumption, you're saying at the start, there are 10 people, I'm going to count 10 people. By the time you get to the end, you've pushed everyone down for every delete, then you'll run out of numbers and you'll have stopped counting at like 7. You're like, wait a minute, where's the other 3? Well, you've pushed them out of the list because you're counting to 10 and the indexes are shifting. And so it's the difference between something being stacked or going from one side or the other. And so the reason why you see sometimes people do what's called a reverse for loop, or if you're using the shortcut FORR and press tab to autofill that, what you're doing is if you delete from the back, so if I start at the end of a list and I go down through and I delete, and I go down through and delete, the count never changes down this way because I'm changing behind me, not in front of me. So whenever you're deleting something from a collection, work in reverse.
Generally a good rule. You can also just right click and hit refactor and hit reverse for loop when you've got one. You're like, oh, hey, I'm removing things from this. Just hit the reverse button and it'll just refactor and make it easy so you don't mess up the calculation. Half the time I try to manually rewrite it, I mess it up. Like a little typo. All right, so I've almost got the code pulled up. We'll be there and oh no, I don't.
One of my biggest mistakes when I started was there was a rare crash in Terraria that was completely random and there was no way to figure it out. And you read the code like 15 times and you don't see the problem. But it was a for loop that was going down and counting up. So the index would go -2 billion and it would still keep going. And it was really difficult to replicate until I got to that freeze and I was like, breakpoint, show me where it is. And I was like, wait, this is not right.
Yeah, breakpoints are great for finding stuff. Especially when you can't figure it out in the code. You'll sit there and look at the data, see what the hell's going on.
Yeah, it's really useful, especially when the game freezes, which is a sign of an infinite loop somewhere. Usually you'll get other exceptions and it already sends you straight to the stack trace and you can see everything that went wrong. But for loops, you have no result for that.
All right, what file should I open up here, Jason? I'm gonna get
so thankfully I was smart enough to write the names as I went. So the first one that I have something interesting to say about is Foliage Spawner.
Foliage Spawner. All right, I'm gonna find that one and then we'll get it up and shared. Maybe I'm gonna find it. Maybe not. Do you know what folder that was in?
No, I didn't write down the folders because you just sent me like a folder of a zip file full of various stuff. Well, whichever one you're on, fake leaderboard. I've got stuff about that too. Maybe we'll do it that way. You bring up a script and I'll make a comment about whatever the script is.
All right, sounds like a plan. Let's go giant picture-in-picture, and I will zoom in the code a ton. Get rid of that whole left side since we don't need it. And we'll take a look. So this is the fake leaderboard.
Yes. So first thing to note about this, I want to make a point is that I went through the various code for the project, and I got to say I really like 90% of the code here. It's well written, it's clean, it's easily explained, and the code shows a very good understanding of a lot of the nuances of Unity and performance and stuff. So I was quite impressed, just to start with. But so a lot of the nitpicking I'm going to do is mostly around clarity of code rather than anything else. So the first thing that came to mind is this is fake leaderboard, and it is effectively an overload of leaderboard. Right. And the first thing I would say is nothing about leaderboards as a concept really requires it to be a monobehavior. So right now it's a monobehavior, and it's obviously the reason why is so that you can drop it in the hierarchy. But I would say, truth be told, something like a high score system, it doesn't need to exist in the scene. It can just be a class, because if you think about it, whenever you call something a monobehavior, what you're saying is this uses monobehavior related stuff, and it doesn't. Like literally nothing about this really uses. In fact, even the lists and things are all being populated within the script. There's no reason for it to externally ever reference it. So that's one. Two, there's this concept of leaky implementation. And one thing that really threw me off at first, if you go to the base leaderboard class again,
Okay.
you'll notice there's two things at the end here after high score on success and on failure. These are called callback functions. They are effectively you saying, go and do a thing, and then when you're done with the thing, let me know you did the thing. So it's a very simple way of handling the concept of something that might be asynchronous. You don't know, go to a place, you don't know where it is. And I was really wondering why that's there, because if you look at the code here in fake leaderboard, it's not needing that really. And I realized later that what's happened is there is a version of the leaderboard that's using, I think it's PlayFab or one of the variants. And what I noticed is that's an asynchronous leaderboard, and so this has secretly leaked the implementation of how that other system works into the contract for the base one that all the other ones have to use. And that's generally a bad idea. So I would say, philosophically speaking, from a design perspective, do you need every submission to a leaderboard to give you a callback function for on success or failure? Are you going to handle unique scoreboard entries differently? Or are you more realistically saying, send this score, and if a scoreboard fails for whatever reason, let me know, as opposed to send this unique instance and let me know? Long story short, callback functions are useful for asynchronous tasks that return values of data or that do a task with unique results. So if you're sending stuff that you need to care about unique results, in this case, I don't think you do. So I would probably instead, personal design decision, as a leaderboard, I would just have an event on the leaderboard itself saying failed to submit or succeeded submit, and then the call to leaderboard sending score would just send a score. And so in that, again, base contract for leaderboard, you'd notice it would be a simpler contract. It would just be load, here's some stuff, and send, here's some stuff. So long story short, I would recommend against using callback functions in chains like this if they don't actually add value to what you're doing. And in this case, I don't think they really do. Anyone else got thoughts on that before I move on to something else?
No, I do think there was something to say about the tries and catches happening inside the code too. It's like it's expecting to be able to fail even though it's a fake one that cannot.
Yeah.
Oh, in this one right here?
Yeah.
So that's there purely because by the act of using that callback functions, there feels like a necessity to handle failure. And the only way to handle failure is a try-catch block. And so this comes back to that leaking implementation concept again, yeah.
Got it, yeah. Trying to force implementation of it. Interesting.
Yeah,
but I guess probably this fake my guess is that all the leaderboards are going to be asynchronous, though. I wonder if he needs the data back from on the success or not, though. I guess where is it being registered, or where is it being submitted? You know,
there's another class called High Score that uses leaderboard, I think, or something around. High Score is a struct. I forgot there's a. Either way, that's not super important. It's just purely that I would say when using a callback function, ask yourself why it's there. And in this case, I can very clearly see it's only there because that's what the contract of the PlayFab one has. It's not actually being used in a valuable sense. What really matters is if sending to a scoreboard fails, let me know so I can update the UI and said failed to send score. You don't actually need every single unique call to have its own potential callbacks. So that's one. And another one I just mentioned that my own thing. Right now, because it's a mono behavior, you're sort of tied to having to have some implementation. But if leaderboard was a contract, it was just an interface, you could use the null object pattern to have no leaderboard. And then the no leaderboard could be the default. And then you would never need null checks. You wouldn't need to go through the other various solutions. It would just simplify the code a lot. So if there's something like a leaderboard, again, it doesn't need to be mono behavior and can just be a contract. It doesn't really need all of the extra kind of cruft that comes with it.
Yeah, there is one little benefit though, which is that if they want in debug, they can just switch over to debug mode and take a look at that high score data right there. Right, you can just view it in the inspector. Outside of that,
that's true.
Not really much. You just have to make sure that it's now in your scene and spawned and all that. And found, but I mean, it looks like everything's maybe not everything. Some of the stuff's static at least. So, were there some other classes you're?
Oh no. I've got like there's so many things here. I'm not even finished with the fake leaderboard, so I'm going to finish on this one because this has got a lot in here. Next, I wanted to say with randomness here, there's a lot of randomness code that's happening throughout this fake leaderboard that basically boils down to the same thing. In this case, name plus equals constant random range 0 constant value whatever. And if you notice, once you start to see repetition like that, what you're really saying is you're doing one thing. And in this case, you're getting a random element from an array. And so something that I do in this case is I make an extension method. I would make an extension method that extends lists, and it's just called pick random. And now every single time here, where it's constants, vowels, or whatever, you could just write constants.pick random, vowels.pick random, and you're kind of encapsulating that one bit of behavior. It's doing a lot here for it obfuscates intent. Is kind of what I'm getting at. If that line name plus equals random consonant is actually, that's all you're saying, but this is the difference between intent versus code. Like, that's a lot of words that boils down to random consonant, please, right? And so if you can isolate your intent separately, it makes the code easier to read and work with.
I'm talking muted, but yeah, it looks like it grabs a consonant and then a vowel and then a consonant and a vowel and just continues on back and forth to build up a random name. Yeah, you can also do that with like a link statement.
Actually, that's a good point.
Go ahead.
I have, for example, here a random. Let me pull this up actually because it kind of makes sense. I was talking to Andrew about this. I as part of my example, I made a randomizer that randomly picks a bunch of item names. And so just to show you how I handle random, it's very similar, but it'll just demonstrate kind of what I'm getting at.
You're gonna pull up some sample code for us to see?
Yeah, I'll just send you a little snippet here.
All right, cool. And everybody's gonna hit thumbs up while we wait for it. So I assume it's just grabbing something random from a collection, like an extension method or something.
Yeah, but I think it's more it's more about the philosophy of the kind of clarity of what you're going for here. Let me see if I can. Maybe I should just try to figure out sharing. I think it might be low resolution, but I'll give it a try, I guess.
Yeah, just pop that button on and we'll see how it works. If it's just a web page, it's not a video, it's probably
yeah,
okay.
Good point.
My guess is that it'll probably show just fine if it's static stuff.
Yeah, okay. Let me pull up then some stuff here.
So yeah, we'll have to go through and do a full code review of this thing too. I'm hoping maybe like next week we can do actual like deep dive into some of the bigger concepts and stuff. Did you get a chance to look at any of the big stuff in here, by the way?
Yeah, I can show up. Like, so, can let me know if you can see my screen.
It's there. It's up now.
Yeah. So here's my set of notes. So I wrote notes on pretty much every script in that thing.
It's not exactly in a readable state, though.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Right. That's the problem with sharing at my horrible resolution. You're going to get.
It does look cool for a game engine scripture, though.
yeah.
Sure.
That is why. Now you see why I said not to share my screen in particular. But let me say, you don't have Discord open, so how do I send you a quick script? I guess I can just paste bin it here. Let's do this.
Drop it in a gist. What I always do, just.github.com. Yeah, I like the alien language version you had there, Jason.
Yeah,
this is that's what code looks like to everybody that can't read it, though. It's like, oh, a bunch of weird letters and words and like half of words and weird braces around the words. Like, you look at it. I'm just looking at what's on here now. Like, imagine you can't read code at all. You're like, what the hell is this? They've got half of the alphabet in here with quotation marks and braces in it.
The problem, of course, is you don't get the syntax highlighting as nicely with a gist file. I probably should have changed the type. But let me do that real quick.
Oh, yeah, you got to put the file extension. You put .text.
I know, I refreshed.
Yeah.
Try it again. I refreshed it.
Yeah,
there we go.
It's fine now.
Oh, did you refresh it?
Yeah.
It's still a oh, there we go. Okay, so let's screen share this one. We'll pull this thing up. All right, let's see. Stop screen sharing. Screen share again. Go back to Chrome, and we'll get into the gist here.
So I'm only demonstrating this. You can ignore this is just text files. None of this matters. All I'm saying is I'm consuming from a list. But what I want to highlight is more the way I approach randomizing content. So if you look at the item randomizer, this is a combination of what's called the builder pattern, and then I'm also using some little helpers and things. So notice how when I build a random item, starting at line 50, notice how it reads, right? It's the same thing. It's the principle of here's a thing, I want to randomly create a thing, but ask yourself, is that difficult to understand, right? Create a random item. It's an item with an ID that's random, with a name that's random, with a prefix that's random, which uses a random adverb, with a suffix that's random, which uses a random suffix. And so if I wanted to go through and start to change the behavior of this, it's obviously not going to be too difficult to figure out where that would be. And something I highlighted to Andrew, especially, we were talking about this before, look at line 68. If I want to check a true, like just a quick coin flip for a check, I could just use random.value greater than 0.5, and without getting into the idea that that's actually slightly weighted, that's technically not an even flip, doesn't really matter right now. It's good enough for this test. What I'm really saying, though, the difference between my intent and the code I'm writing is my intent is flip a coin. If it's this, do this. If it's this, do this. Rather than writing random.value everywhere, writing coin flip reads better. So line 62 says, if coin flip, do this, else do something else, do another coin flip. If it's that, do that. You know what I mean? So it's about, if you're going to be doing things like randomness, ask yourself if you can kind of clear that up in terms of the linguistics of what you're doing. And how did those randomness get picked? Well, you'll see here, random weapon is when I take the weapons list and I pick a random. Random adverb is when I take the adverbs list and I pick a random. And that pick random is just an extension method that it does exactly the same thing. The code behind that line is exactly what you saw earlier, which was, index random.range 0, list.length. It's exactly the same code, but you're not seeing that here because that doesn't matter. What matters is my intent, which is given a list, pick a random element from that list. Similarly, on line 83, you'll see here I've got this thing called consumables. It's where I take a text file full of lines, and then each line is one consumable item. And that's just how I can populate the fake data. I don't like, you'll notice in the example in the other script, you'll notice there was arrays of letters and things. I don't like having the hard-coded values that generate this be inside of the file. In this case, I have a bunch of text files. The text files get loaded into strings. The strings get used for randomization. So I can change that without rewriting the code. It goes back to open-close principle. But what matters is how am I getting those lines out of the text file? Well, the actual code for that is get the text, read the text, for each line, split the line by new line values, and then for each new line return it. But do you actually care how I do it? Not really. In this context, what matters is the consumables are the consumables in the list, each of the lines, right? And so it reads like what my intent is, not what the actual code is. And this is something I really want to drill down with people when they're designing code like this. Separate out the implementation from the intent. And like I said, it doesn't matter what code I'm using, but ask yourself if you have a hard time understanding what's going on. Like 71, random ID is in this case a GUID to a string, so it's the quickest thing I can think of. But does it matter? Not really. What matters is my intent, which is give me your random ID to populate this item with. So separate those two concepts. So that's just if we go back to the other code to demonstrate the difference, you'll see what I'm saying now, hopefully.
Yeah, let me switch back to it real quick. Back to that window right here, and that was in
the fake leaderboard. So notice how the intent is the same. It's get a random constant, get a random vowel, generate random name. In my case, this would have been random name, which is consonant.getRandom or pick random, vowel.pick random, and then build it up. But in this case, we're seeing how, as the phrase goes, the sausage is made. There's a lot of detail in here that all it's really doing is boiling down to give me a random name. And it obfuscates the, like think of how much information you're learning about stuff that's irrelevant to the concept of fake leaderboards. In my case, I would have had a fake name builder or a fake name generator, and I would say, give me a random name. And you'd never see that code in a leaderboard because it's not relevant to leaderboards. And this leads to a different other side effect, which is the leaderboard the only place you'll ever need fake names? Like realistically, you might use it again, and if you do, it's a lot of redundancy. So the idea of picking random names has nothing to do with leaderboards and should probably be its own thing as like a random name builder, or in my case, because what you're talking about is random leaderboard entries, I would have made a thing that builds random leaderboard entries, but different conversation. It's either way, the point is to figure out what a job is and separate the jobs.
Definitely interesting. I want to dive deeper into this code, but I need to actually go through the whole project and stuff and be able to talk a little bit more.
Let me do one in particular
with all you guys.
There's one in particular I wanted to highlight though in the GameData.cs because that was the bit that I was trying to get to that I was referencing earlier.
Oh, okay. Let's reshare that one then. GameData.cs.
Yeah. So it's a subtle thing, but it can be quite a surprise. So line 12 there's this thing called score changed, and it's an action of type int. And so that basically says there's some event fired when the game data changes, and it tells you what the new value is. And this is a fairly innocuous piece of code, nothing wrong with it. It fires an event when the game data changes. But here's something that you may not realize. If I, in another script somewhere in the project, write GameData.scoreChanged equals null, I kill all subscribed events. I have now broken any event that has ever subscribed to game data, and I have thrown an exception, hypothetically, if that goes right. In this case, it is guarded on 21 with a null check, but that doesn't work. But if I do event, as Jason beat me to it, this turns it into not an action callback, but an event. And what that means is you're no longer allowed to, 1, invoke it outside this class, and 2, you can't delete it anymore. So if you don't put event there, I can actually say anywhere in the code, GameData.scoreChange.invoke. I can fire that event even though I'm not the owner of the event, right? But if it's an event with keyword, then you can't. Only GameData is allowed to invoke that event, and you can't clear out the other people's events. All you can do is add yourself to the list or remove yourself from the list, but you can't delete the other people's list entries. So it's a safeguard against people effectively messing with your events. So if you're using actions for events, prefix it with the event keyword.
I would say almost always have the event keyword before action, unless there's some rare scenario where you only want one thing registering for it. But I can't remember one. I know it's happened before in the past, but I can't remember the scenarios where I've needed to do that. Very, very rare.
Do we want to open the discussion about whether it's good to use delegates here?
Yeah, you know what? Fire away. You take charge on that.
So one thing that's I have a somewhat mild opinion on, and in Relogic at least I recommend that we use delegates, is when you make an action and you give it some arguments, you're not telling anyone what is the intent of this action. You're not telling anyone what to expect out of subscribing to it if it's an event. One solution to this, in C# at least, is that you can define an explicit method contract that is called a delegate, and you're saying, this is the type of thing I am expecting. Please use that. And it allows at least the IDEs to create subscription methods for you that accept the arguments with names that tell you what you're getting. So score changed int tells you nothing about what the int is. It could be the score, which is what you expect, but it could also be times the score changed. And it could
I think if you open up, I think it's ghostsystem.cs, Jason. That one has an example that is confusing enough that'll match what we're talking about here. Oh no, maybe this is the wrong one. I was going to point out because I know there was a bunch of actions in here, and I thought there was one with some variables. Never mind. Sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. So basically, you're not getting any information on what the event you got is. And because you don't get any information, you can make the wrong judgment call on how to handle what you got, the arguments in it. When you create a delegate, you're making an explicit contract. This is what I'm expecting. This is the only thing I'll ever give you. And if it changes, well, now you know what's the new changes if you rewrite the method instead of having to guess what a new argument is. Because if we had a score changed int, float, you don't know what the float is anymore. But if I told you the float is now the decimal point, or the float is now the entire score, you can't tell unless I give it to you explicitly. Yeah, that's another thing. You don't know why you have two ints. You can make the judgment call whether it was the old score.
That's the one I was looking for. That's the one. Yeah, exactly.
Something like this.
Yeah. So in that instance, exactly, it's confusing because you don't know what you're actually passing in or using in this instance, or which one is which. You can kind of intuit it, but like you shouldn't have to. You shouldn't have unknown, especially because if you write score changed plus equals on score changed or whatever, it's not going to tell you. It's going to automatically go arg1, arg2, and you're going to have to go, wait, is arg1 the old one or the new one? And it's not going to be easy to figure out.
Yes, and there's also another thing about that is that when you change a delegate, you're saying my contract changed, I need new things. That's all well and fine, but all the subscription methods now have to change as well. And if you don't know what the new arguments are, you're kind of screwed trying to figure it out like all the way back for however many references you have. It gets worse the more subscriptions you have.
Now, one caveat to that, though, I do want to make it very clear personally.
Yeah.
If you have an action and it doesn't have any arguments, don't, in my opinion, make a delegate that has no parameters in it. If you're just using a delegate, just use the action, because what happens is you end up with this really annoying case where people can't just use a method invocation. They have to use your delegate just to use it. Case in point, I love DoTween. I use DoTween in tons of projects. But so many times I can't just pass a function in that's an action into DoTweens on complete because they require this arbitrary tween callback delegate that is exactly the same contract as action, has no differentiating features, no arguments in or out, and requires me to write this hack around it just because they didn't use action when it's a perfectly fine thing to use in that context. Not that it bothers me, but just, you know.
Not that it bothers
Not
you.
at all, right? Yeah, I generally use action for anything where I've got not too many parameters, or I'll cut it down to have just one thing that I'm passing. A lot of the time I can just pass in the object that changed or the data that changed as a parameter instead of having to make a whole delegate.
My general way to go is I make a struct or a small data representation of all my arguments, and then I pass that in, so I don't have to change all the method calls as my delegate changes, because in the end I'm just saying, hey, an event happened, this is what matters to the event, take it. And I don't think I need multiple arguments to say that.
And if not only is that a good solution, it's literally Microsoft's recommendation solution, because there's something called an event handler and event args, and they recommend, I think it's overkill for games, but it's usually good for enterprise, is to override or to implement the event handler and the event args and then make your own event args. So by default, every event fired via the Microsoft standard has two arguments, the sender and the event args. So you can basically keep the standard, and then there's a default called eventargs.empty, which is there are no arguments for this event. Again, I don't really use that in this kind of case, but the idea of having a bundled set of properties that is one packet of data for an event is pretty much the Microsoft standard.
Yeah, I never do that either, though. Well, at least not outside of enterprise stuff. I used to do that in my enterprise development all the time, but in games, yeah, most actions and occasionally a delegate, and like you already said, the structs to hold the args or the data that's changed, because then you can name it for score changed amount and new score and old score or whatever it is, or the source of the change or whatever the parameters are. You just drop them in and keep adding them without having to change your code too much. So I wanted to take some questions from people, but I know Yuri also had some interesting thoughts on animations and timeline and stuff that we were starting to get into before we went live. I don't know if you want to kind of jump back into that and maybe have a little discussion there.
We can have that. It's about Unity, and it's pretty into the fine details. There's also something that we kind of skimmed over halfway when we talked about disabling update calls. There's actually a Unity blog post I linked earlier in our chat that is literally called 1000 update calls, and it's worth taking a look at if you've never seen it.
Just drop that in chat for everybody too. I'm to look at that.
Okay, one moment. You did. Okay. So basically, that blog post talks about how an empty lifecycle method can still take your performance and cripple it entirely. And one warning I wanted to give people is that when you create a new script in Unity, it automatically populates with an update and a start method. And those are lifecycle methods, which means they take this cost. So make sure you remove them as you write new scripts if you don't use them. Or better yet, do what Jason Story does and change the template to not even include them if you don't need them.
Though, that being said, to play devil's advocate, one, we are talking about 10,000 or more for empty calls to get that level of cost. Now, I still recommend removing them, but it's not like it's going to realistically hit the average person with like a couple hundred update calls in their game. But the second part of this, which is a warning, I've seen a pattern where a lot of developers will make a base mono behavior of their own type. And I've seen this on YouTube tutorials and it makes my eyes bleed. Is whenever someone recommends doing a base function and making virtual calls for awake, start, on collision enter, on collision exit, on trigger enter, on trigger exit, and then implementing their own base object and overriding the ones they care about. Do not do that. There we go. For base, exactly, base mono behavior, right in front of you. Don't ever do this. This is insane. You've basically registered a whole bunch of stuff that does nothing but costs you performance. Do not, if you're using a base mono behavior, override a bunch of defaults. Only do the ones you're actually using.
There's not much to say about this other than the final note of making a manual update for your game, which will actually run faster because it's direct C# calls instead of Unity's magic methods. I've actually seen this in practice when I've tried making something very, very performance intense, a live 3D bullet hell in VR. I actually ended up needing to do this because I had more than 2,000 projectiles on screen at any given point, and it doesn't end well if you let Unity handle the updates for you.
And if you want like a really quick win on this, if you have a bunch of children objects, some parent object with a bunch of children, say you've got 100 child items, and each child object does an update, literally all you have to do is remove the update function, make your own one called update self or something, put that list in the parent object, and have the parent object say, for each child, update self. It does conceptually exactly the same thing, but you've suddenly saved yourself having a bunch of... Because the way I'd look at it is, each mono behavior, it's like it's individually registering and handling its own data. It's like, imagine you're... there's a vending machine and everyone is individually going up to the vending machine and handling stuff and going back and forth. What you're going to get into a case is you've got all of this extra work being done, when if one person was doing it and handing things out, you could go faster because there's a cycle where it's all being done in one loop, right? So whenever you can limit things to a simplified loop, it'll make things easier to reason about and easier to work with. So in this case, if you've got a bunch of individual objects, they shouldn't be individually... Actually, probably a better example would be like, because it's updates, it's like checking the mail. It's like having 500 people walk up and then check the mail every time themselves versus sending the mail. Having one person check all the mail and deliver it to the right people, right? It's the set. Don't have everything registered uniquely for their own data. Have one thing manage that for everybody else.
So do we want to go for the animation stuff or another topic?
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting to just talk a little bit about the animation stuff and the animator. And you were working with animators and timeline and stuff. You want to just share a little bit about it? Maybe if somebody here has some good solutions and ideas too, or just learn something from the way that you set it up.
So to give some context to everyone, earlier we talked about a project I've been trying to make, which is I've been trying to make a nice 3D combat-oriented game, something like Devil May Cry. And I wanted to be able to offer animations in Unity's editor very easily. When you look at how other developers do it for the big games, you can see that they usually have this really nice frame data editor where you can see every frame has this duration for this active hitbox, this duration for invulnerability frames, in this amount of time you rotate towards any target. And I wanted that in Unity. And I started looking at what solution is available that takes the least amount of effort. And I went through every Unity available package, so to speak, to see how it solves that. So we have Unity's base animation system, where you import an animation. It comes with the curves for every bone, every event. Well, it's not using curves for an event, but it has the event tickers. And those let you pass in simple arguments. It's not exactly great because all the curves have to be floats. And that means you can't do a bull curve, or rather, you can only if you offer the entire animation in Unity, which is a struggle in itself because now you can't make an animation in a dedicated animation software such as Blender or Cascadeur or 3ds Max or Maya. So that was a no-go for me. Then I tried to check Timeline, which, for those who don't know, it's a Unity package that lets you offer specific montages of things happening. And it comes with some nice view of tracks that all handle different elements with their specific data needs. So for example, it has a Cinemachine integration, which lets you say, activate this camera for this duration and place it here and there and do things. So for power moves, for example, where you want to close up, you can just drag in a Cinemachine object, say, for this many frames, be here. And the big advantage of Timeline, above being able to offer the data as you please, is that you can scrub back and forth and immediately see in editor without entering play mode exactly how each frame looks. It's what Jason is showing.
That's this little white bar right here, right? You just
Yeah.
grab that and drag it around right while you're playing or in edit time.
Yeah. And to make things even nicer, you can actually extend the timeline and write your own mixer tracks for every possible class that you ever make. So if you wanted to say deal damage event, you can make an event and put it directly in the timeline with almost no code. Or if you wanted to adjust light, you can also do that. Even better, Unity provides a lot of samples for it, and a lot of there's a package on the asset store that literally extends timeline and shows you some really neat things with it.
And for example, some of the things that I've done on projects that I've used Timeline for is I had a project which was like a sequenced narrative, and there was characters who had emotions. So you different characters in the scene would be angry or happy or sad. I built an emotion track, and I could then let the designer go in, scrub along the animations, and pop animation sections which are emotional states, and then things in the scene would change color or animations would change relative to emotional states. I did another one once which would read a Audition XML file and strip out all of the different events as outlined in Audition, and then make timeline markers that would, drop into the timeline to match the position, so I could fire events without having to manually place them in. You've done stuff like dialogue, where you can write dialogue in line alongside, and because you can do, as we were talking about there, mixer tracks, you can blend these. So I had, for the emotional state one, for example, you could crossfade emotions. You could have two different states that would blend automatically, and then the mixer track would handle the percentage fade, so people could be 80% happy and 20% confused. And I didn't have to care about that. That's up to the designer to choose how that looks in the track. So custom timeline stuff can be very powerful. You can do a lot of stuff with it.
Yes, and that looks like a perfect system. So I decided, sure, let's go with that. Let's try it. I also wanted to use Unity's animation rigging package, which is fairly new. It just came out of preview recently. If you've never heard of it, it's a bunch of animator constraints that will adjust how your character holds things or does things using mostly inverse kinematics or other mediums of changing position and rotation in a very clean way. One thing that's very common in games is that you want a character to, for example, have inverse kinematics for the legs, so they always stand on the floor and don't float if the floor has slope. And the new animation rigging package can do that for you. It also does multi-parent bone constraints, which means a character can hold things in two hands and they match, which was more difficult than it needs to be with the default animator. So I went ahead and I made a project. I put the timeline in, I put the animation rigging package in, and I got a model with some animations from the asset store, and I dropped it in just so I can test things. And very quickly, some things became not as fun. So timeline is a package that you add to a project. It's not by default in the Unity code. And because of that, it means it accesses things just as we do. It's not internal to Unity engine, which means it can only access public things. Which means that if there is a system that it needs to give values to doesn't expose it, timeline will hack for it. And one place that it came into relevance is, have you ever used Unity's on-animator move event? Are you familiar with it?
I've actually not used that before, no.
So whenever an animator updates and it has root motion, the on-animator move call is given to you so that you can add your own root motion or override what is there. And animators come with a delta position and a delta rotation field, which means you can see this frame, it moved this much. That frame, it moved that much. So if you had, say, a character controller and you wanted to propagate how an animator moves to the character controller, which is affected by physics, which can't go through walls, you say, okay, the animator moved. Don't actually move the game object, though. Just give me the values. I'll move it myself. And to do that, you need to have proper delta position and rotation. The problem is timeline, by the nature of being able to scrap back and forth, it actually re-evaluates the entire animator every time that it updates. And that means the delta position and delta rotation are actually the full position and rotation every time you sample it. So I said, sure, timeline has to hack it. I can deal with that. I can manually hack and unhack it, get the delta position and rotation just fine. So I go ahead and I say, manually evaluate the timeline every time I want it to, so that I can wrap it around and say, set it to the position that I needed it, keep the values, make some subtraction. Not a very big deal. But when I did that, the animation rigging package broke. And that's because Playables, the underlying new system that Unity uses for their entire animation, has graphs that it builds, and they have to all connect with each other in a way that when you sample a graph, evaluate it, it has to update all the graphs in a certain order. And once you stop one graph from evaluating properly, it actually breaks the chain. So, luckily, the rig builder in the animation rigging package actually exposes the graph, and I only discovered it like earlier today, that you can rebuild the graph so that they still work properly together. But it's still not an entirely solved issue. I'm still trying to figure it out. But I wanted to say that the Playables system is actually super powerful, and it's worth looking into if you've never heard of it. One big advantage is when you use an animator and an animator controller, you have to have all the animations loaded for a character at once. So say a character has a million different weapons and each of them has unique animations. You pay all the memory cost up front just by loading in that character for, say, one cutscene. Even though they only will use the sword in that specific case. Playables let you build graphs of animation clips on runtime, and that means you can load them in, only pay the memory cost of the animations you need, and then load them out. Restructure your graphs. It's really, really nice. I just wanted to let people know it's out there, it exists, and it's fun, but there are caveats that you need to start handling.
That's Unity 101, right? There's always some bloody irritating... It's funny, I had a different problem altogether, but it's so similar in terms of the issue, which was I was working on a project with the new XR input module. So Unity have released this new XR input module that kind of aggregates all of the VR headsets and AR headsets and all this stuff. And it's got this really convoluted but super abstract, arguably too abstract, contract system where you could say, get me the input of the axis or which hand is moving or the velocity of the object. And there's even stuff like get me the specific sensors on the device. But because it's so abstract, you actually don't know what you're dealing with. You have to say, get me the XR input device, check if it has a sensor, get me the sensor value. But what sensor? I don't know, whatever sensor evaluates to on that object, whatever it happens to be. And so you only have the features that are supported by whatever's there. Anyway, it's a whole separate topic. The only reason I bring it up is to say it has this nice input system. It's inbuilt. You could basically have a UI in the scene and you can raycast to it and you can click and interact with stuff. But one thing that we had, a very simple requirement, is we wanted to touch a screen, like a little actual touch screen. And so what we wanted to do is when you hover your finger over an UI element, we would highlight the object just like you would if you were touching it. Now, the way the normal Unity event system works is it creates a pointer event data, tells you the hover state of some object that you're interacting with. And so you can basically have buttons, which you've seen the states where they're enter the button, exit the button, select the button, and it changes color and does whatever. That's all I wanted. I wanted a button to change color when you hover over it, and when you click it, it does the thing. The button did it. It worked fine in the editor. It worked fine when I clicked it. Put in the input system. Worked fine with the right cast, but it doesn't support it for touch. So we wanted to support that, and so just thought, okay, it's pretty easy. I'll just grab the hover state, put a box collider near the screen. If your hand goes into the box collider, change the hover state of the object. Very easy, right? Except I can't access that hover state because that pointer data is private inside of that object and I can't access it. And if I try to build it myself, it'll happen on a different frame at different time and I won't have the correct state of the object of that. Long story short, very similar problem. Unity has, inside of some object, somewhere in the middle of an XR input module, the piece of data I need that's privately hidden that tells me whether something's hovered or not, and there are 0 ways for me to access it without reflecting the state of the object and going down this giant rabbit hole, all because they just didn't expose a way to access a feature that, quite frankly, an input system, whether something's hovered or not, that's not an obscure thing.
Yeah.
You have an input system, hovered, selected, focused, remove focus, and I can't tell at any point whether an object has been hovered over or left focus. The only information I have is if it's selected, which is infuriating and caused a whole lot of issues. So yeah, Unity does this a lot.
Yeah, Unity event system and the Unity UI module in general, it hides a lot of things that people consider essential. Part of that is because they said only the input module that handles pointers should be privy to that kind of information because it's the one generating the pointer calls in reality. But when you change the input module, you actually change what we work with. Now, the original ones are extendable, but as you mentioned earlier, the XR input creates them at runtime, the instances that handle it for you. And because it creates them at runtime, it means you cannot extend them and say, make this one instead of yours. And you cannot access the information that you would have otherwise extended. So pretty annoying minor details.
Yeah, and one thing I was going to bring up when we were reviewing that other code earlier is one example of something which has been sort of upgraded from hidden secret feature to accessible feature is there's a function on transforms called set position, which you're used to, or dot position or dot rotation. There's another one called set position and rotation. Literally, transform dot set position and rotation. It's an internal function that Unity's been using because it's ever so slightly more performant than doing 2 completely separate checks for changing the transform state. And for a very long time, that was internal. You couldn't use it, but Unity could, and they eventually made that public. So if you ever find yourself in quick succession, which is something that's happening in that code, don't call position equals blank, rotation equals blank, set position and rotation. Small thing, saves some performance.
I think Writer will actually recommend that to you if you write those lines. It'll give you a little hint and tell you to do that. Yeah, nice little tiny performance improvement, but it helps if you got a lot of calls to it. It's happening a lot. I wanted to take some questions too before we run out of time. We've only got a few minutes, and there were a couple of them that had popped up. One of them was about Andrew's stream, and I guess real quickly, you want to just talk about your stream, Andrew, before we jump into some of the other questions that have popped up?
Sure.
The one that's coming up right after this.
Yeah, thanks for adding it to the description. Around noon, I'll be streaming more of my production on Legend of the Stones. And today I will be implementing what I think is my takeaway from our talk with Jason that we went over earlier in this stream as well, making a stats spitter outer, basically that will spit out stats based on the players that you give it. And so that's the next step, and then doing more saving and loading on that. And all of this relies around or falls around my loot system on randomizing loot in chests and other things, bad guys, and whatnot.
Nice. For your averages and sums and stuff, are you just using link statements, by the way?
I'm starting to use more link statements. Jason's been exposing me to. I've used them in the past, but not in depth. And I recently found actually one of your old posts on links last night. So I'm using them more. Yes, is the short answer, but still learning about it in the process.
Okay, it's one way to write, at least to get things like averages, because you can just give it a collection and do dot average, and then give it the property you want the average of, and it will just return back the average. And you might have to look at performance if it's something that you're calling in a hot path.
Yeah, I was going to say something.
Assuming that it's not.
We should flag that because somebody somewhere is going to be, but Link isn't as good for performance, and yeah, someone's going to say that. So I'm going to catch it right now. Yes, Link is worse for performance than if you were to just do a for loop through stuff. But in terms of pre-optimization, like if you're calculating a bunch of stats and it's not a matter of doing it again, difference between event-driven versus update loops, most of the time it's just, I have a bunch of data, calculate the average, put it somewhere. You can afford the tiny bit of garbage. If you're micro-optimizing stuff, I guarantee you, if you think you're doing a good job by going through and removing every time you ever allocate tiny amounts of garbage in your averages functions or something, there's a better place to put that energy if you really want to optimize your game. There is somewhere where something is actually causing an issue that isn't micro-optimization. So write the simplest version that works, nice and clean with link statements, and then if in the profiler it's an issue, fix it then. Don't pre-optimize just because. Don't write a complicated set of for loops and whatever when .sum, .average will do for now until it doesn't.
Totally agree. So here, let's hit a couple of these questions. This first one was just about if somebody wanted to work specifically on multiplayer networking. Is that something that's desired or not really necessary? And I assume this is getting into a job, getting into a game development career, if you just want to work on multiplayer networking. In my experience, it is definitely it's an extremely valuable skill if you're good at it. If you understand it really well and you're good at it, it's an extremely sought after skill, and it can easily get you into a lot of places. But it depends on the place. If the place isn't doing multiplayer stuff, or they already have their entire networking stack already built up and somebody is working on it and dealing with it, probably not as in demand. It's a good thing to have. I wouldn't say that it'll get you a job on its own, though. So if you only know the networking part and nothing else, no, but it's definitely valuable at some subset of companies. Now that subset's probably only like 5 or 10% though that are making multiplayer networked games where this actually matters. Most places and make single player stuff. But what about you guys? What has your experience been on hiring network engineers or network developers in general?
So I actually wanted to bring it up. It's not my own opinion, but I did some research, and there are the 4 big jobs that are in high demand always ever, and they are networking, tools development, tech art, which is the shaders and all the things that you mentioned hating before, and experience, UI, XR, experience development. And they will always be in demand. So if you want to specialize in it, go ahead. You'll always have a job to find, but it's not an easy topic. There's a reason it's in high demand.
Yeah, and you don't have to be good at all of them. Like, I will hands up say, experience design, I can do that. Tool development, I can do that. Shader magic and networking stuff, find someone else. It's not my area. I can do enough, but I'm willing to hands up and say if it's about project development, I will find somebody else. Like, as we discussed earlier, have somebody help me with networking stuff because it's not entirely my area in certain cases. So you don't need to know all the things. Just pick what you like or good at and specialize in those.
Yeah.
If you do like networking, though, it is a good one. And like I said, it's high demand, and you can demand a good pay for it too. I mean, you can definitely get paid more if you're good at that stuff, or any one of the things that you listed, especially the tech art. Tech artists are like one of the craziest paid positions that I've seen in actual game companies. Like tech artists,
the unicorn.
It's also the one I'm jealous of most. If I could pick any two, if I could just choose which one I could be good at, it would be tech art, but I'm not. So.
Oh, you guys got anything else on that, or should we jump on to timeline performance?
I think we can jump. So.
All right. So yeah, the question was just, can we speak on timeline performance, because it's difficult to find anything about it. And personally, I can't really. I haven't really done a lot with timeline. I played with it a bit, but I've never dove into using it at scale at all. So I'm curious if anybody else has.
So I did some. Yeah, go ahead, Jason.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
So I did some research on it on the past week, and basically it boils down to timeline runs on Unity's playable graphs, which run on jobs and other internal small optimizations that can help out its performance. The one caveat is it has to sync a stream from the scene, say, here are all the things that you needed, put them into whatever processes the timeline, then spit them back out. And that, while it's not expensive in its own right, sometimes it can mess up with your values. So performance, it's good. It has a clean output, fast processing, clean input. But you will find issues if you manually evaluate it, because what you're saying is, while a timeline is supposed to be sequential and evaluate over time, if you say, hang on, go back, evaluate that frame for me, it actually has to do everything from scratch just to reach that point. And then you lose out on performance because you have to reevaluate everything over time. So say we take a particle system and that has velocity over time and et cetera, it actually has to animate that entire duration just to reach the frame you asked it to evaluate. So small caveat.
That's one thing I was going to mention, is that think of the timeline like an animator. Is that what people don't realize is that it's effectively frame states, and every frame is a calculated thing of what you're doing, and you can get into weird or interesting states there, where if you're doing custom playables and timelines, people can run any code they like. You're saying, on this frame, for each of my things, do X. And so a problem that we've run into is I've worked on systems which have very long timelines. So a timeline is an object with a bunch of tracks. Each track does something with a bunch of objects. And so it's not that timeline is bad for performance. It's that, like anything, you can tax it. In our case, if you have a single master timeline with a bunch of child tracks, you'll get into weird territories where it chugs or has performance issues. And you can put a timeline control tracks in other timelines. And so if you're not paying attention, you can get into weird scenarios where one timeline is running 3 timelines, where each timeline is running timelines, where those timelines have tracks of objects, and stuff can get really messy really fast. So I would just say, be aware that it is running like it's doing calculated frames. And so if something is a complicated process and you're doing it in multiple frames, you're going to hit multiple performance issues with that. Usually, though, it's fine. Like, honestly, I've used a lot of them in lots of cases. The only time it's ever been an issue is when we have like 60 items all on one frame, like animating, doing different stuff in one big timeline, and it's like it's going to choke a bit, you know.
Sounds like a giant timeline, dude. I'm glad I've never had to work with one that big. So there was one more question I think I want to hit, and then maybe we'll start to wrap things up unless something else really important pops up. And it was just about, because we talked about link performance earlier. His question was, how is link bad for performance? So I think that when we briefly just mentioned, hey, link is bad for performance if it's in a hot path, and not really saying why, there are, I think, 2 different things there. One is that it might take up a tiny little bit more CPU cycles, depending on what the statement is. Probably not. More likely, it's going to take up less CPU cycles because it's going to be more optimized at writing the code than you are, depending on how good you are at writing your code. But the bigger issue is that it allocates memory. And that's where the problem is. That's what the thing that people say, like, don't use link in Unity, or at least don't use it in the hot path for, because it's going to allocate memory, and it allocates a tiny little bit of memory. But if you're doing that every update and you're doing it many times, and sometimes it could allocate a lot of memory depending on the statement, but by default it's allocating a really small amount of memory, but it adds up really quick, and then you get to garbage collection issues, and then you get to frame stutters and other problems that you want to generally avoid. You guys have more just thoughts on the general link stuff?
So in link, when you actually say call any link method, you're basically generating an enumerator, and something that enumerates your collection. And that's the memory cost that you pay. If you know that you're paying that, this is where on the performance costs, it's actually because partially you have to go back into the enumerator you created get something, take it out, and then do something on that, go back in, take something out. And that is a performance cost on method call level. It's tiny, but it does rack up if you have a lot of calls in, say, an update loop that go over a lot of objects. Now, there is a third cost, actually, that a lot of people disregard. But when you make a Lambda anonymous call to say where X is something that I need, you're basically creating a method instance in memory, and you're telling it, use that. And that's actually a cost that you can pay, and it's also slower than...
Even more if there's closures. If that statement references variables higher up, not only does it make a method, it makes an entire class with a variable, with a method, and uses that in line just for that single Lambda.
Yeah, so when you can, do not use anonymous methods in your link statements. You can actually write a plain method that accepts the exact same argument as your link and let that be called. You can also debug it a bit more easily because there's clean breakpoint lines. And as you do it, you can see that your intent becomes cleaner as you write your link, because you say collection where stuff I need, check, or whatever.
Yeah, and I recommend that all the time. That's one. And I was actually going to bring it up too, because that's something in that code that we were looking at. Is for example, if I have a bunch of objects that are in the wrong type. So, an example we were talking, Steph and Andrew with the stream last time, was the difference between item to spawn and item. They're two unique item types. They're both classes with their own names, with their own data. One has to turn into the other at some stage. How do you deal with this? Well, with link, you can write thing.select, and then you can do some transformation that selects that object as a different type. And you could do an anonymous delegate there, but if you don't and you use a custom method, you can call it something like toItem. So a method called toItem that takes in an item to some other thing, spits out an item, and then you don't need to have that anonymous delegate. I will say another aspect to the link question as well is this is also why people say there's a difference between for each and for. It's like use for instead of for each where possible, because what you don't realize, and I've said this before, enumerator isn't, it's not the same as a list. Like it is not a list at all in memory. That's not how it works. It is an object which steps through things. And so again, anytime you create an object, it causes memory issues, and that's what we were mentioning earlier. But what matters is for each does that. All that for each does is it runs the enumerator for you, as opposed to a for loop, which doesn't run the enumerator, but grabs the object's indexes. So technically, for is always going to be more performant than for each, because you don't have to create the object and iterate through it.
Didn't they change that like in 2019? Change it so that the for each loop, then they're no longer allocating.
It is more performant, but it is, if you do, again, you're talking 10,000 or 100,000 cycles, it's still more performant to use for loops. Not by much.
They removed the memory allocation.
They have removed the memory allocation, yes. In that particular
that
instance,
was the big issue before, with for each loops used to allocate an enumerator and cause garbage collection, and they don't anymore.
Yeah.
At least unless I totally misunderstood
that. You're 100% right.
Which wouldn't surprise me.
But I'm talking more about the people don't realize that that's what for each is doing. For each is basically running an enumerator for you. Is kind of in general what the philosophy of what it's doing, and that's why it's different than a for loop.
So since we're still on link, there were a couple other questions, but I wanted to just wrap it up with this one that was related. Plus, Mr. Provost dropped in a super chat, so got to prioritize that, right? And it says, if it's probably worse for performance, what are the reasons to use link? Readability, ease of use. Yes, those are the two main reasons. You're going to be able to write the code that does the thing and probably explain it all in a single line of code for most link statements that you're writing, and be able to write it without writing another like 5 or 10 lines of code to deal with it and build up all the boilerplate stuff. It's handling all of the simple things that you need to do and don't need to worry too much about performance on. And most things you don't need to worry about performance on. To be honest, like 90% of the code isn't in the hot path. It's the 10% that's getting called commonly that I really care about optimizing performance, or the stuff that shows up in the profiler. Go ahead, Jason.
No, I was going to say, because it's one thing too, is just be really clear here. We're not saying in every case link is worse for performance. Here's the thing, that's be very careful. Link can be better for performance as well, depending on the context you're using it. Because the difference is, if you're using for loops, you have to iterate yourself multiple times. One thing that's really powerful about link is creating, as we discussed earlier, an enumerator, a thing that knows how to step through items. And if you're doing multiple transformations, you can basically use link, and link will actually be automatically optimize that for you. So your one thing goes through multiple steps and comes out the other end. If you don't use link, you have to do a transformation, then do another transformation, and another transformation, and that might be more performance costing than using a link statement which says, get this, where this, and this, do this, join this, and this, do this, whatever, and then let it optimize that for you automatically into build the optimal path. Prime example of this would be using something like link to SQL. So rather than you basically saying, get me all the items from the database. For each item in the database, get me the ones where the name is whatever. Okay, now for each one of those, get me the ones where the age is whatever. What you don't realize is if you don't know what you're doing, you will have queried a database to get back every item ever. Tons of items, and then you would have done in-memory filtering and all of those things. If you use a link to SQL, it will generate a performant SQL statement for you. Not as performant if you know what you're doing and write your own, but it will create one that will do the filters and joins in the database, not in memory. So you end up getting back only the items you asked for, and that's far more performant than pulling in the entire list from a database and filtering locally. So it's not that it's always worse for performance if you're doing multiple or complex filtering or data. So don't just say link equals bad for performance, but it reads better. There are actual reasons why it's better for performance too, if you understand that it's doing compound calculations for you.
And to touch a bit on the readability, every time that you write code, you're saying, I am a human, I want code that humans can read. You trade performance for readability every single time. So when we say use a for loop instead of a for each, or for loop instead of link, we're saying your code will be slightly less readable for extra added performance. But you don't always need that performance, especially if it's not in the hot path, if it's not getting called frequently. You want the code to be easiest to understand, easiest to change. And we as humans, especially programmers, we spend more time reading code than we spend writing code. So the longer it takes us to read, do some random math, decide to do something with the object, if we can just read one line that says, take all soldiers where soldiers are alive, it's going to be way faster to work with. So it's a cost for your performance as a developer as well.
And one other thing too, this is kind of slightly to the tangent of link, but it's worth mentioning. Talk about application boundaries earlier. You can solve this question better than from a better perspective. Example I mentioned to Andrew earlier is if I have something called products, if I make a class called products, I could either use list item or a class called products. And the class called products internally uses a list of item. If I ask the products, get me products I can afford, and then it'll do some internal filtering, I could write a link statement inside of that object that results in me getting some objects back. And that might be the bad for performance version, but because I've encapsulated my request into products.getMe thing, get me products I can afford, I could then optimize it later internally without affecting the contract I've written for the rest of the system. So part of the whole point of using good contracts and good boundary lines is if you even do decide to optimize out, you can then have clean places to do it that won't affect the rest of your code. So the boundaries actually let you tackle the performance issues later, which is a very powerful thing to have.
I love how you're able to tie it right back into the boundaries. It goes back into these neat lines, but you're not wrong, right? That's why you would do it, so you can change that stuff out and optimize it later. All right, well, I think we are about out of time. It's noon over here, so late everywhere else. I guess I just wanted to say thanks again, everybody, for coming out, joining us, and watching us live. Make sure that you hit thumbs up, share the stream, and all that stuff. And I think if you guys are up for it, next week I want to do a stream of mostly just Q&A. Just take a bunch of questions, see what people want to know, and try to answer them. And to make that easier, I was thinking everybody could just, if you have questions that you want to ask for the next one, drop them in as a comment below, and we'll prioritize we'll maybe pick out a couple of them from there first, and we'll hit the comments from this stream, the questions that pop up on there first, and then we'll go into live questions. So if you have anything that you want to ask for the next stream that you didn't get to ask now, or just want to ask or you come up with over the next week, just drop it down below, and then we'll prioritize at least a couple, maybe pick like the first 5 of those or top 5 of those or something, and then go on and take other questions. Outside of that, Andrew is going live in just a few minutes. I've got the link down below so that everybody can go join him and see him kind of implement some of the stuff we've been blabbing about. So you're going to see it actually on screen in code in an actual game that's playable. That's your opportunity for that. And did you guys have anything else you wanted to share? Jason, Yorai, Andrew? Nobody's got anything. All right. Well, next week, I think I'm going to have some cool new hardware stuff to share too. Hopefully, it's supposed to be here. We'll see if it actually arrives. Like the ultimate programmer tool. We'll see if it comes or not. It says it's in the mail, but I don't know. The mail key is lost, so I got Apple tiles to stop losing the mail key. First, I got to find the key to attach the tile to it. So if that ever happens and I can get it out, I'll have something cool. All right. Thanks again, everybody, for coming out and joining us. Thanks, Jason, Yorai, and Andrew for being here. If you're curious about any of the stuff we talked about, there's links down below. There's links for my courses and Andrew's stream and Jason's talk about this stuff. Yorai, we got to get you some links down there too. Stuff. And I think Salim might be back next week as well. So we'll see how it goes. If he's able to join in and have audio next week, that'd be awesome. Talk a lot more about game design and stuff and answer some of those questions as well. All right. I'm going to shut up now and stop just nonstop talking. Thanks again, everybody, and goodbye.
Bye.